On the 2nd of December, 1804, in the great cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, a man of 35 committed the most audacious act of an audacious life, and he did it to the face of the Pope. He had summoned Pope Pius VII from Rome to bless the ceremony, to lend the oldest authority in Europe to the newest throne on the continent. And at the decisive moment, when by the tradition of 1,000 years the Pope should have lifted the crown and set it upon the new sovereign's head, the man reached out, took the crown from the pontiff's hands, turned his back on the altar, and crowned himself. No one had given him the empire, he had taken it. That single gesture, a self-made emperor who would owe his crown to no god, no dynasty, and no birth, but only to himself, is the truest thing ever said about Napoleon Bonaparte, and he said it without a word. We remember him in two ways, and both are wrong by being only half. The first is romance, the invincible genius, the little corporal betrayed at the last by winter and fate. The second is caricature, the mad ogre, the ridiculous little man greedy for the world. Both legends were manufactured, one of them, in large part, by Napoleon himself, dictating his own gospel from a rock in the South Atlantic at the end of his life. The real man is larger than either and stranger and darker. He gave the world a code of law that still stands 2 centuries on, and threw open the door of advancement to talent wherever his armies marched. And in the very same years, with the very same will, he sent millions of men to their deaths, built one of the first modern police states, and forced back onto a freed people the chains of slavery that the revolution had struck off. The real Napoleon was nothing like the legend the memoirs built. To understand the man who crowned himself Emperor of the French, you must first understand that he was not, by the ordinary reckoning of blood and birth, French at all, and that he became so by an accident of timing so narrow it can be measured in weeks. He was born on an island. Corsica sits in the Mediterranean off the coast of Italy, a place of granite mountains and old feuds and fierce local pride, and for centuries it had belonged not to France but to the distant Republic of Genoa. By the middle of the 18th century, Genoa could no longer hold it. The Corsicans, under a remarkable patriot named Pasquale Paoli, had risen and built a republic of their own, one of the most advanced experiments in self-government anywhere in Europe. And Genoa, unable to crush it, chose instead to sell the problem to a greater power. By the Treaty of Versailles, signed in May of 1768, Genoa ceded Corsica to the Kingdom of France. Paoli and his islanders fought on against their new masters, and in May of 1769, at a river crossing called Ponte Novo, the French army broke them. Paoli fled into exile. Corsica became French by force of arms, and it was into that freshly conquered island, its rebellion barely 3 months cold, that a child was born in the town of Ajaccio on the 15th of August, 1769. His family christened him in the Italian of the island, Napoleone di Bonaparte, and only later, when it suited him, would he file the name down into its harder French form, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a French subject from his first breath, but he was a French subject by conquest, by a matter of months, born to a people who had been fighting the French with guns within the year, and that fact, the fact of the outsider, would sit beneath everything he ever did. His people were what the island called nobility, though it was a modest thing by the standards of the great courts. The Buonaparte were minor gentry of ultimately Italian descent, respectable, propertied enough, connected in the small politics of Ajaccio, but a very long way from rich. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer, handsome and ambitious, and something of a schemer who had ridden with Paoli's patriots in the years of the rebellion, and then, when the cause was lost, made a swift and clear-eyed peace with the conquerors. It was a decision that would shape his second son's entire future. By declaring for France and cultivating the new French governor, Carlo secured for his family the one thing that mattered, recognition of their noble rank, and with it the right to send his boys to be educated at the French crown's expense in the schools of the mainland. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a different kind of force altogether, young, beautiful, iron-willed, and formidably strict, a woman who had borne children through a guerrilla war and who governed her large family with a hand that never softened. The son who would one day command Europe learned his first lessons in discipline from her. It was a crowded household. Napoleon was the second of the 8 Bonaparte children who lived to grow up, and in the years of his greatness he would set his brothers on the thrones of Europe and marry his sisters into its princely houses. But in the beginning they were only that, a large, ambitious, not quite wealthy provincial family scrambling for advantage on a poor and distant island. And so, At the age of 9, the boy was taken from his island and sent north into France, first briefly to the town of Autun to acquire the French language he did not yet properly speak, and then, in the spring of 1779, to the Royal Military Academy at Brienne in the flat country of Champagne. He would spend 5 years there, and they were not happy ones. The record is plain about it, without any need to invent his feelings. He was a poor boy among rich ones, a provincial among the polished, and above all, a foreigner among the sons of the French aristocracy who never let him forget it. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent and a stumbling tongue. He had no money and no fashionable connections. He came from a place his schoolmates regarded as a half-savage rock, recently and rightly subdued. They mocked him for all of it. And the boy did what solitary, proud, and slighted children have always done. He turned inward, and he turned to work. The recollections of those who were at Brienne with him, set down, it must be said, long after he had become the most famous man alive and colored by that fame, describe a serious, reserved, watchful boy, proud and quick to take offense, already a little apart from the crowd around him. What he turned to, above all, was mathematics. It is worth pausing on that because it is the key to the whole man. In a world that measured people by the rank of their birth and the grace of their manners, mathematics was the one country where none of that counted for anything, where a Corsican charity scholar stood exactly equal to a duke's son, because a number is either right or it is wrong, and no accent and no title can make it otherwise. Bonaparte was very good at it. He was quick, precise, relentless, with a memory that hoarded detail and a mind that reduced messy problems to clean calculation. It marked him out, and it carried him upward. In 1784, he was chosen to go on to the elite École Militaire in Paris itself, and there he trained for the branch of the army that suited his gift perfectly: the artillery, the science of the guns, the one arm of 18th century warfare that was pure applied mathematics, all range and trajectory and the massing of fire. The course that stood between a cadet and his commission normally ran 2 years or more. Bonaparte, impatient and able, drove through it in a single year and passed out an officer while still only 16. In the autumn of 1785, he was made a second lieutenant in the artillery and posted to the regiment of La Fère in garrison at the provincial town of Valence, a very junior officer in an unglamorous corps at the quiet far end of the kingdom. That same year, his father died. Carlo Buonaparte was carried off by a cancer of the stomach, a detail worth holding quietly in mind because it was the very same disease that would, 36 years later and half a world away, kill his son. The father's death left the family's finances precarious and threw new weight onto the shoulders of the serious young officer, who now had a mother and siblings partly depending on his meager pay. He was, in these years, anything but the future master of Europe. He was a junior officer in a provincial garrison, bookish and intense and perpetually short of money, reading history and philosophy in his cramped quarters and dreaming. And here is the great irony that the later legend worked so hard to bury, dreaming not of conquering Europe for France, but of freeing Corsica from it. He read enormously in the long idle hours of garrison life, history and geography, the campaigns of the great commanders and the philosophers of the age, above all Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas of liberty and the nation fell on him like rain on parched ground. And whenever he could contrive it, he went home. Across the years between his commissioning and the Revolution, he spent long stretches of leave back on the island, far more than a diligent officer was strictly permitted, plunging into the small, fierce politics of Corsica, writing on its history and nursing the cause of its independence. For the young Napoleon was, first and last, a Corsican patriot. His hero in these years was not any French king or general, but Pasquale Paoli, the exiled father of the island's lost republic. His passion was the cause of Corsican liberty. The France he served with his sword he regarded, in the privacy of his own writings, as the occupier of his homeland. Had history run only a little differently, he might have spent his life as an obscure and disappointed champion of a small island's independence, and the name Bonaparte would mean nothing to anyone today. What changed everything, what took this angry, gifted foreign young officer and forged him into the most dangerous soldier in the world, was an earthquake that struck the whole of France in the summer of his 20th year, and that would, in time, shatter his Corsican loyalties as completely as it shattered everything else. It would drive his own family from their island as refugees. It would offer a penniless artillery lieutenant a road to power that no peacetime army in Europe could ever have offered him, and it would need, more than it needed anything, men who knew how to fight. So the man the world would remember as the very incarnation of France began as something stranger and more revealing. A foreigner born a subject of a conquered island, mocked in the schoolrooms of his rulers for the way he spoke their language. He was not born to power, he was not born to France. Everything he became, he would have to seize, and he came of age at the one moment in the history of Europe when a poor and foreign artillery lieutenant, with nothing to his name but ambition and an unnatural gift for calculation, might seize almost anything at all. For while young Bonaparte drilled his gunners in a sleepy provincial garrison, the ground beneath the oldest throne in Europe had begun, very quietly, to move. In the summer of 1789, in Paris, the revolution broke, and it would need soldiers. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte came of age in the army, the old machinery of privilege that had governed France for 1,000 years was coming apart, and it was coming apart at precisely the point where a poor and foreign lieutenant most needed it to give way. The revolution that broke in 1789 was not merely a change of ministers or a season of riots in Paris, it was the total liquidation of a world order. Under the monarchy, a man of Napoleon's origins, a minor provincial noble from a newly conquered island, the son of a lawyer with more debts than land, could look forward to a modest career and an iron ceiling. The great commands of France were the hereditary property of the old families, held by right of blood and guarded by custom, and no quantity of talent could pry them loose. Then, in the span of a few years, the whole edifice dissolved. The king was toppled in the summer of 1792 and beheaded in January 1793. The noble officers who had owned the army fled abroad in their thousands or were purged as traitors to the Republic, and the young Republic, encircled by the armies of Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and Piedmont Sardinia, found itself fighting for its very survival. From 1792, France was at war with much of Europe at once, and in the summer of 1793 it summoned an entire generation to the colors in the levée en masse, the first true mass conscription of the modern world. A nation in arms needed men who could win, and it had stopped asking where they were born. The door that birth had bolted, the revolution blew off its hinges. It was a desperate and merciless engine that now needed him. The Republic's armies were enormous, improvised, and half-trained, raw volunteers folded in among the surviving regulars, driven forward in dense columns and loose swarms of skirmishers, watched over by civilian representatives on mission who carried the authority of the convention and the shadow of the guillotine into the camps. Promotion came at a speed unthinkable a decade before. A capable officer could vault from captain to general in a single year. But the same revolution that made generals overnight also unmade them. Commanders who lost or who were merely suspected of half-heartedness were recalled, denounced, and in more than one case sent to the scaffold. This was the world in which Bonaparte would rise. It rewarded victory with dizzying advancement and punished failure with death. For an officer of cold nerve and total competence, it was the most dangerous opportunity in the history of Europe. Here, the central paradox of his life was set turning. Napoleon was the child of that upheaval, a man raised up because the age had finally decided that ability should count for more than pedigree. He would carry that principle across the continent on the points of his bayonets, tearing down the feudal privileges of every state he overran, and he would also become the man who strangled the same revolution at home, hoarding its power in his own hands, silencing its press, and raising over it a new and rigid hierarchy of his own devising. He was the heir of the revolution and its gravedigger at once, and the two impulses were braided together from his first step into its service. That step was neither smooth nor swift, for his deepest loyalty ran at first not to France but to the island he had come from. As the revolution radicalized, the politics of Corsica convulsed with it, and the island's aged patriot leader, Pasquale Paoli, slid into open conflict with the centralizing Jacobinism of Paris. When Paoli turned for protection to Britain, the oldest and most implacable enemy of the Republic, the Bonaparte family had to choose, and they chose France. In 1793, the split hardened into a small civil war on the island. The Bonapartes were denounced as traitors to the Corsican cause, their home near Ajaccio was plundered, and the whole family fled across the sea to the French mainland as penniless refugees. The dream of a free Corsica died for Napoleon in that flight. He came ashore in southern France with little more than his uniform, a mother, and a brood of younger siblings dependent on him and his training as a gunner. He was now, and would remain, a soldier of France by necessity fully as much as by conviction. He had been shaped for exactly this moment by the one branch of the service that prized calculation over birth. Commissioned into the artillery as a boy of 16, he had passed his early years in the garrison towns of Valence and Auxonne, reading omnivorously and mastering the mathematics of range and trajectory and the weight of massed guns. In the summer of 1793, he set his politics down on paper in a pamphlet, Le Souper de Beaucaire, arguing the Jacobin case for the Republic against its internal rebels. It was slight in itself, but it marked him to the faction then in power as a reliable man, and in that revolution, a good name with the right men was the ladder to the place where competence could be seen. That place was Toulon. In the late summer of 1793, the great naval arsenal on the Mediterranean had risen against the revolutionary government, proclaimed the imprisoned boy the Royalists called Louis XVII, and thrown open its harbor to a British and Spanish fleet under Admiral Hood. It was a disaster of the first order. The Republic's principal southern base and much of its Mediterranean navy delivered to the enemy without a shot. A ragged revolutionary army was sent to retake the port, but it was led by men without a plan, and the siege ground to a standstill. Bonaparte arrived almost by chance, sent to take over the artillery after its commander was wounded, and with the backing of two powerful patrons, the Corsican deputy Salicetti and Augustin Robespierre, brother of the man who all but ruled France, he was given room to act. He saw the answer at once, and it was a problem in geometry rather than a feat of arms. A narrow promontory, the Aiguillette, commanded the inner roadstead where the Allied fleet lay at anchor. Plant guns on its heights, and the ships would be forced to withdraw, and once the ships were gone, the town could not be held. The commanding general, Dugommier, backed his plan. Bonaparte massed his batteries against the redoubt the British had thrown up to guard the point. They called it Little Gibraltar, and drove the bombardment forward with relentless energy through weeks of fighting. In the final assault, in December 1793, he was wounded in the thigh, but he had judged the whole matter exactly. The Allied fleet, its anchorage swept by French guns, weighed and sailed, carrying off what it could and burning the rest. Toulon fell. He was 24 years old, and within days he was named a general of brigade, a promotion won not by a monarch's favor, but by the cold efficiency of his own military judgment. Yet, in the whirlpool of the Terror, a rise so sudden was as fragile as it was steep. Bonaparte had climbed on the shoulders of the Robespierrist faction, and when the Robespierres fell in the summer of 1794, the ground opened beneath him. He was arrested as a suspect associate, held for a fortnight in the fortress of Fort Carré near Antibes, and stood for a moment at the lip of the same abyss that had swallowed thousands of others. But the new men in power needed soldiers, and nothing could be proven against him. He was released, cleared, and left to drift on the margins of the capital. When he was ordered to fight the rebels of the Vendée in an infantry command, he thought beneath an artilleryman he refused, and was struck from the active list for it. In the spring of 1795, the future master of Europe was a general without a command, haunting the antechambers of the government in a worn coat, his prospects all but spent. His chance came in October 1795. The Revolutionary Convention, in the very act of legislating itself out of existence, had decreed that 2/3 of the new legislature must be drawn from its own seating members, a naked device to keep power that enraged the royalists of Paris. A large and well-armed insurrection gathered to march on the convention and finish the Republic in the streets. In its panic, the government turned to Paul Barras, and Barras turned to the young general with the reputation from Toulon. Bonaparte understood that a crowd, however vast, could not stand against disciplined artillery, and he moved with total, unsentimental speed. He sent a young cavalry officer named Murat galloping to seize the cannon parked at the camp of Sablons before the insurgents could reach them, and when the royalist columns pressed toward the Tuileries and the steps of the church of Saint-Roch, he met them with grape shot fired at close range into the crowded streets. The rising evaporated in the smoke in a single afternoon, leaving several hundred dead. Later generations would drape the moment in a memorable phrase, the whiff of grape shot, as though it had been the offhand gesture of a man of destiny. But that is the legend at work. The words were coined by the historian Thomas Carlyle nearly 40 years afterward and never spoken by anyone who stood in those streets. What actually happened was plainer and far more lethal, a calculated act of violence, delivered without a flicker of hesitation, to rescue a regime that was terrified for its life. The gratitude of the Republic was immediate and immense. He was confirmed a general of division, given command of the Army of the Interior, and drawn into the inner circles of the men who now governed France. And in the spring of 1796 he was handed the prize he had wanted above all others, command of the Army of Italy. It was not the gift it appeared to be. That army was a collection of unpaid, underfed, half-mutinous men, huddled in the Ligurian mountains without shoes or supply, holding a forgotten front against the Austrians and the Piedmontese. The serious men in Paris did not yet grasp that for a man armed with nothing but his own will and a mind built for the arithmetic of war, an impossible task was not a wall but an open door. In 2 years, the foreign lieutenant nobody had wanted had made himself indispensable to the men who held France. The soldier who took Toulon when the generals could not. The soldier who saved the government in the streets of Paris when the Republic itself was shaking. They rewarded him with an army, the ragged, unpaid, half-starving Army of Italy, sent to fight a holding action on a forgotten front against the Austrians and the Piedmontese, a command the great men of the moment thought too poor and too hopeless to matter. It was meant to be a graveyard for an ambitious young general's reputation. Instead, in the space of a single year, it would become the stage on which Europe first learned the name Bonaparte and learned to be afraid of it. Before he turned his attention to the map of Europe, Napoleon turned it to the salon of a Parisian widow. In the spring of 1796, only days before he was to leave for the Italian front, he married Josephine de Beauharnais in a brief civil ceremony. She was a woman of the colonies, born on a sugar plantation in Martinique, and a survivor of the Revolution's cruelties who had already lived several lives before she met him. To the raw, intense provincial artilleryman, 6 years her junior, she was intoxicating, worldly, graceful, unhurried, at ease in the drawing rooms of power that had always closed their doors to him. To Josephine, the match was a shrewd, pragmatic alliance with a rising man of the Republic whose ferocious energy she found as unsettling as it was promising. It was even he who reshaped her name. She had been christened Marie-Joseph Rose and called Rose all her life, until Napoleon, preferring a name no one else had used, began to call her Josephine, and so she has been known ever since. Her history was written in the blood of the Terror. Her first husband, Alexandre de Beauharnais, was a nobleman and a general of the Republic who had fallen under suspicion and gone to the guillotine in the summer of 1794. Josephine herself had been imprisoned in the Carmes convent in Paris and had come within the turn of a political tide of following him to the scaffold, saved only by the fall of Robespierre. She emerged a widow with 2 children, Eugène and Hortense, no fortune, and a great deal of charm, and she made her way in the loosened, pleasure-seeking society of the new regime, for a time as the companion of Barras, the most powerful of the men who governed France. She was, in short, precisely the bridge to the world of influence that the outsider from Corsica had never been able to cross, and the marriage carried him into the heart of the Directory's circle at the very moment it was deciding what to do with him. The imbalance of the union was immediate and profound. Thrust into the heat of a brutal campaign, Napoleon poured his loneliness and his desperate need into letters that reached Paris like dispatches from a fever, demanding her presence, agonizing over her silences, writing in the dead of night from the misery of the front as though his whole existence hung on her affection. Those letters survive, and they are the letters of a man possessed. Josephine, meanwhile, lingered in the capital in no hurry to join him, and during these months kept the company of a young cavalry officer. The marriage was the first great contradiction of his adult life, a love match born of genuine blinding passion and a marriage of cold advantage at one and the same time. It was the opening of a hunger for permanence and a dynasty that would drive him for the rest of his days and that he would never truly satisfy. He left her in Paris and rode south to find an army that was, by every ordinary measure, the ghost of a fighting force, ragged, starving, unpaid, without shoes or cartridges or hope, clinging to the mountain passes above the the Italian plain. The generals before him had seen only the shortages. Bonaparte, looking at the same men, saw an instrument. He understood that in the new warfare of the revolution, morale was a weapon as real as gunpowder, and he spoke to his soldiers not as an aristocrat to his inferiors but as one man of the ranks to another, promising them the wealth of the fertile plains below. In the famous version of his proclamation, the one the world would come to know, he told them, "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much and can give you nothing." But that ringing text is itself a monument of the legend, not a record of the day. He reconstructed and polished it years afterward, dictating it in his exile on St. Helena to his companion Montholon. The actual proclamations of 1796 were plainer and grittier, and were reported back to Paris in the workmanlike prose of his chief of staff, Berthier. The soldiers of that spring heard a rougher, humbler speech than the one that entered the history books, but the legend Napoleon built around the moment became the version history chose to keep. What followed, he unleashed with a speed that paralyzed his enemies. He treated the campaign as a mathematician treats an equation, reducing the chaos and friction of war to a series of sharp, concentrated blows. He struck first at the seam between the two allied armies, driving between the Austrians and the Piedmontese to keep them apart and beat them one at a time. Within weeks of his opening victory at Montenotte, he had knocked Piedmont clean out of the war, forcing an armistice at Cherasco in the spring of 1796. He stormed across the bridge at Lodi in May and entered Milan in triumph. He pinned the main Austrian army into the great fortress of Mantua and beat back, one after another, the armies sent to relieve it, through the murderous marsh-bound fighting at Arcole in November and the decisive winter victory at Rivoli in January 1797. When Mantua at last surrendered, he drove north through the mountains toward Vienna itself until the greatest power in Central Europe, with the Corsican upstart approaching its capital, was compelled to ask for terms. He did not merely win battles, he dismantled the old order of a continent, and he did it in the space of a single year. But the speed had its price, and it was paid in the bodies of his own soldiers marched to the edge of collapse, thrown across rivers and dikes into the mouths of the guns. The fighting at Arcole alone consumed thousands of lives across 3 days of struggle over a few hundred yards of marsh. The victories were real, and so was the arithmetic of the dead that lay beneath them. But the most revolutionary weapon in his arsenal was not his cannon, it was his pen. Napoleon was the first commander of the age to grasp that fame was a resource to be manufactured and managed. He did not wait for history to record his deeds, he recorded them himself. He founded newspapers dedicated to the glory of his army. He wrote and circulated the electrifying bulletins that transformed every march and skirmish into an episode of destiny, printed and devoured in every corner of France, so freely embroidered that the dispatches of his armies would in time give the French language a proverb to lie like a bulletin. And when he commissioned the young painter Antoine Jongros to capture him at the bridge of Arcole, standard in hand, wild-eyed, fearless, the living spirit of the revolution, he was not sitting for a portrait so much as minting an icon. The invincible young genius was not a verdict that history handed down to him later. It was a product designed and shipped in real time to a public starving for a hero. The seam runs straight through the campaign. Much of what the world would come to call Napoleon was already being written in these very months by Napoleon. As the campaign deepened, his conduct outgrew the bounds of any general. He began to act as a sovereign in his own right. He negotiated directly with princes and the Pope, redrew the map of northern Italy into new French-aligned republics, the Cisalpine, the Ligurian, and stripped the conquered land with method and on a scale never seen before. His agents combed the churches and palaces and galleries of Italy for their treasures and sent them north to Paris as tribute, paintings and manuscripts and ancient statues, the bronze horses of Venice, masterpieces prized from the Vatican itself, carried in convoys over the Alps to fill the museum that the Revolution had made of the Louvre. And the money flowed with the art, tens of millions in levied gold that helped keep the bankrupt Directory afloat, so that the army in Italy came to finance the very government it served. The burden of it fell hard on the towns and villages made to pay, and where they resisted, as at Pavia and later across the Veneto, the risings were crushed without mercy. Liberation and pillage arrived in the same marching columns. When he dictated the peace at last, in the Treaty of Campo Formio in the autumn of 1797, he did it largely on his own authority, presenting his nominal masters in Paris with a settlement they had not sanctioned but could not undo, and in it he traded away the 1,000-year-old Republic of Venice to Austria, extinguishing an ancient state with a stroke of the pen to seal his bargain. The servant of the Republic had become a power the Republic could no longer command. By the end of 1797, he was the most famous and most dangerous man in France, and the men who governed it watched his ascent with a mixture of awe and dread. They could not court-martial a hero the nation adored. They could not ignore a general who had shown he would follow his own orders over theirs. They needed him to be somewhere else. And Napoleon, whose restless mind was already reaching past the borders of Europe toward the legends of the ancient East, was willing to go. The government saw their salvation in his restlessness. They proposed a campaign that would serve both his hunger for glory and their need for distance. An expedition to Egypt, a bold and perilous strike against the British lifeline to India. It was a project of immense, almost impossible scale, shrouded in the romanticism of the Orient and the promise of discovery. It was the perfect stage for a hero and the perfect exile for a threat. He had gone to Italy an unknown, in command of an army too poor to matter, and he had come back the most talked-about man in Europe, a general who beat empires, dictated treaties to kings, and sent home paintings of himself as a demigod on a burning bridge. France did not quite know what it had made. The men who governed it knew only that they could neither control him nor be rid of him, and that a hero with an army and a hunger this large was a danger to any republic that tried to hold him. So they offered him the one thing grand enough to tempt him out of France altogether, a dream as old as Alexander, of conquest in the East, of Egypt and the road to India, and a name written beside the ancients. It was a trap dressed as a destiny. And Napoleon, who could read every man in a room, walked into it with his eyes open, because the size of the dream was exactly the size of his ambition. The ambition that had carried the young general out of Italy was not to be satisfied by the mere subjugation of provinces. Napoleon wanted the stage of the ancients. In the spring of 1798, the Directory, anxious above all to be rid of the brilliant and difficult soldier who loomed over Paris, granted his request to take an army across the Mediterranean. The declared object was Egypt, a province of the Ottoman Empire that lay astride the routes to British India, a blow aimed at the wealth and the lifeline of France's last unbeaten enemy. Beneath the strategy ran something older and more personal, a dream of conquest in the footsteps of Alexander, of a glory that no European border could ever supply. It was a colossal gamble, for the whole enterprise depended on crossing and then recrossing a sea that the British Navy ruled. The Directory was willing to hazard a fleet and an army on it, partly for the strategic prize and partly for the sheer relief of sending its most dangerous general to the far end of the Mediterranean. The destination was kept so close a secret that most of those who sailed did not know where they were bound. The expedition that left Toulon was vast, some 400 ships and tens of thousands of soldiers, and on its way it seized the island of Malta from the ancient Knights of St. John before slipping across a sea prowled by the British Navy. By a mixture of luck and weather, Napoleon's fleet evaded Nelson, who was hunting it across the Mediterranean, and in the first days of July it landed near Alexandria. The army marched ashore into a furnace of heat and light, and the strangest campaign of Napoleon's life began. He had not come with soldiers alone. Alongside the troops sailed a small army of scholars, mathematicians, engineers, naturalists, astronomers, and artists, more than 150 of them, a traveling academy charged with measuring, mapping, and recording a civilization that Europe knew only through rumor and scripture. It was the contradiction of his whole career made visible. The same man who carried cannon to shatter cities carried the Enlightenment to catalogue them. In Cairo, he founded an Institut d'Égypte and set his savants to work. Among them were some of the finest minds in France: the mathematician Monge, the chemist Berthollet, the naturalist Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, and the tireless artist Vivant Denon, who sketched the temples and tombs from the saddle under a hostile sun. Even as the army beyond the walls slid into a losing war, the savants went on measuring, dissecting, and drawing, Europe's first systematic reckoning with a civilization far older than its own. Their labor was genuine, and it outlasted everything the soldiers did. It produced, over the years that followed, the monumental Description de l'Égypte, the vast illustrated survey, running to volume after volume of plates and text, that founded the modern study of the ancient Nile. The record they brought back astonished Europe. Following the army south in pursuit of the fleeing Mamluks, Denon was among the first Europeans in generations to look on the colossal temples of Upper Egypt, Karnak, Luxor, the ruins of ancient Thebes, and the drawings he published on his return helped set off a wave of fascination with Egypt that ran through the art and design of the age. And in the summer of 1799, soldiers strengthening a fort near the town of Rosetta turned up a slab of black stone inscribed in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. The Rosetta Stone, as it came to be known, would eventually surrender the lost meaning of the hieroglyphs to the scholar Champollion 2 decades later, though by then it sat in the British Museum, seized as a spoil of war when the French army in Egypt was finally forced to capitulate. The conquest failed. The knowledge it unearthed did not. The military reality was swifter and harder. Napoleon took Alexandria, then drove his men south through the shimmering desert toward Cairo, and on the 21st of July, 1798, he met the army of Egypt's Mamluk rulers near the village of Embabe, across the river plain from the pyramids. The Mamluks were a warrior caste of dazzling courage and obsolete method, magnificent horsemen who charged the French with sabers against an enemy that had reduced war to a science. Bonaparte formed his divisions into great hollow squares, hedges of bayonets banked with cannon, and the Mamluk cavalry broke upon them and was slaughtered. It was a one-sided victory that shattered the old order of Egypt in an afternoon. And it is the battle around which one of the most famous of all Napoleonic phrases was later wrapped, the stirring cry that from the summit of the pyramids 40 centuries looked down upon his men. But that line appears in no account from the day. It surfaced only afterward, a piece of theater bolted onto the event to lend it the grandeur of destiny. The fighting was in truth some miles from the monuments, which stood as a jagged smudge on the horizon through the dust. The victory was real. The legend that gilded it was manufactured, like so much else, after the fact. The victory at the pyramids was barely a week old when the sea took its revenge. On the 1st of August 1798, the British Admiral Horatio Nelson at last ran the French fleet to ground where it lay at anchor in the shallows of Aboukir Bay near the mouth of the Nile. In a single night of concentrated violence, he destroyed it, working his ships into the gaps along the anchored French line and firing on them from both sides at once. The French flagship, the Great Orient, blew apart in an explosion so vast that the guns fell silent for a time along the whole bay. Her admiral Brueys died in the battle. Of 13 French ships of the line, 11 were taken or destroyed. In the space of a night, Napoleon's army was severed from France. It had conquered a country it could not leave, could not reinforce, and could not supply by sea. The strategist of Italy had become, at a stroke, a prisoner of his own conquest. From there the campaign curdled. In Cairo, Napoleon set himself up as a ruler as well as a conqueror, issuing grand proclamations to the Egyptians that professed his respect for Islam and cast the French as liberators come to free them from the Mamluk yoke, a piece of political theater aimed as much at the watching world as at the people he now governed. Few were convinced. Cairo rose against the occupiers in the autumn in a revolt that had to be put down street by street and was answered with reprisals that left the city sullen. The country simmered with a resistance that never quite went out. Early in 1799, Napoleon marched north into Syria, hoping to break the gathering Ottoman power and perhaps open a road toward Constantinople. He took the coastal towns, and at Jaffa, after the garrison had surrendered, he ordered the killing of several thousand prisoners, men he could neither feed nor guard nor safely release. It was a cold, deliberate atrocity that stripped the campaign of the last of its heroic pretense, and it belongs in the record as exactly that, without ornament. Then plague broke out among his own soldiers, turning the camps into houses of the dying. He pushed onto the fortress of Acre and could not take it. Its walls were held by a stubborn Ottoman garrison under Djezzar Pasha and stiffened by the British naval officer Sidney Smith, who had captured Napoleon's heavy siege guns at sea and turned them against him. After 2 months of failed assaults and mounting death, Napoleon lifted the siege and led his weakened, fever-ridden army back across the desert to Egypt. A retreat that cost him as dearly as the fighting had, the sick and the wounded strung out and dying under the sun. There he beat off an Ottoman landing at Aboukir in July, a sharp victory he would need because it was very nearly the last thing the campaign gave him worth reporting home. Even as his army rotted in the heat, Napoleon understood the power of the image to override the truth. The failure had to be transfigured, and the man to do it was the painter Gros. The great canvas he would produce, Bonaparte visiting the plague-stricken at Jaffa, shows the general moving fearlessly among his dying men, reaching out with a bare hand to touch the sores of a stricken soldier. Calm, luminous, almost Christ-like, a healer rather than a conqueror. It was a masterpiece of paint and a masterpiece of propaganda composed to bury the memory of the plague and the prisoners beneath an image of serene and fearless virtue. It was not a record of an event, it was the deliberate creation of a legend, and it did its work. By the summer of 1799, the position was beyond saving, and word had reached Egypt that France itself was in crisis. The armies of a new European coalition pressing its frontiers, the government in Paris flailing and despised, the conquests of Italy already unraveling. Napoleon made his choice. In August, telling almost no one, he handed his command to General Kleber by letter, boarded a waiting frigate with a small circle of chosen companions, and sailed for France, leaving behind the army he had led into the sand to hold on without him. Kleber would be murdered in Cairo the following year, and the army, cut off and worn down, would struggle on until it was finally forced to surrender to the British in 1801 and shipped home. He slipped along the coast and across the length of the Mediterranean, evading the British patrols that would have given anything to catch him, and came ashore at Fréjus in October 1799. He had failed. The fleet was at the bottom of Aboukir Bay, the army he left behind was trapped in the sand, and the dream of the East had died at the walls of Acre. By every ordinary reckoning, Napoleon should have come home in disgrace. But Napoleon was never bound by ordinary reckonings, because Napoleon controlled the story, and the France he slipped back into in the autumn of 1799 was not asking hard questions. It was a country exhausted by 10 years of revolution and war, sick of its squabbling and corrupt government, frightened and hungry for a strong hand and a familiar hero. Into that vacuum stepped the general whose defeats never seemed to reach the newspapers, trailing the glamour of Italy and the mystery of the pyramids. The Republic had sent him east to be rid of him. He came back to take it. The France to which Napoleon returned in the autumn of 1799 was a nation suffocating under the weight of its own exhaustion. The government of the Directory, set up 4 years earlier to steady the country after the Terror, had become a hollow and discredited thing, a 5-man executive that behaved less like a government than a cage of rival factions lurching from crisis to crisis in the shadow of bankruptcy. It had learned to survive only by devouring its own legality. When elections went against it, it annulled them. When a faction grew too strong, it purged it by force, in a weary succession of small coups that everyone had stopped counting. The treasury was empty, the roads were infested with brigands, and in 1799 the frontiers themselves had buckled, as the armies of a new European coalition, Austrians and Russians, the latter under the formidable old Marshal Suvorov, drove the French out of much of Italy and undid in a single season the conquests of Bonaparte's own campaigns. By the autumn, the sharpest danger had passed, French victories in Switzerland and Holland steadying the line, but the political rot went deeper than any battlefield, and no victory abroad could mend it. To the men of property and the men of law, the Republic had become a synonym for instability. The great experiment that had begun in 1789 with the rights of man had curdled into a squalid cycle of corruption and coup-essai, and a growing number of serious men had concluded that the only way to save the Republic was to suspend the very republican mechanisms that were tearing it apart. Napoleon did not arrive to invent this conspiracy, he arrived to become its instrument and, in the end, its master. He found a capital already primed for a stroke where the political class was hunting for a sword to cut through its own paralysis. The mind behind the plot was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a veteran of the Revolution's first days who had helped light the fire in 1789 and now, a decade on, was determined to bank it into something stronger and more orderly. Sieyès had a whole constitution worked out in his mind, an elaborate machine of graded assemblies and appointed authority, power descending from above while the mere show of consent rose from below. What he lacked was force. He wanted a general, a famous sword, to overawe the legislature while he remade the state from the top down. He had gone looking for one before. His first choice, General Joubert, had been killed in battle in Italy that summer, and others proved unwilling or unsuitable. The dashing young victor, newly returned from Egypt, trailing the glamour of the pyramids and the memory of Italy, seemed made for the part. Sieyès took him for a blade he could wield and then sheathe, a decoration to lend military weight to a civilian design. It was the fatal miscalculation of the man he had invited into the room. Around the two of them, the web of the coup drew tight, and it gathered the most capable and cynical operators of the age. There was Talleyrand, the incomparable survivor, who had glided from the old church to the revolution and would glide onward through every regime to come. There was Fouché, the cold and watchful minister of police, who knew the secrets of everyone and lent the conspiracy the silence of the state. And there was Napoleon's own younger brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, who by a stroke of fortune held the crucial chair of President of the Council of 500, the more radical of the two legislative chambers. The plan they laid was simple in its cynicism. Under the pretext of a Jacobin plot against the Republic, the councils would be persuaded to remove themselves from the turbulence of Paris to the quiet of the Château de Saint-Cloud. There, isolated and ringed by loyal troops, they would be pressed to dissolve the Directory and hand power to a provisional government of three. To seal it, the plotters arranged for the directors themselves to resign, collapsing the executive from within and leaving a vacuum that only the conspirators were positioned to fill. The 18th of Brumaire, the 9th of November 1799 by the ordinary calendar, began smoothly enough. The Council of Ancients, the senior chamber and the one most thoroughly managed by the plotters, was told of the supposed conspiracy and voted to transfer both councils to Saint-Cloud the next day, entrusting Bonaparte with command of all the troops in Paris to protect them. One by one, the directors were removed from the board. Sieyès and his ally Roger Ducos were in the plot and stepped down. Barras was persuaded to resign and retire to his estate. The remaining two were placed under guard. By the evening of the first day, the executive of France had simply ceased to exist, and an army stood in the streets of Paris under the command of a man who meant to inherit what was left. It had all gone according to design. The second day would not. On the 19th of Brumaire, the conspirators reconvened at Saint-Cloud to finish the work, but the neat, bloodless transfer they had imagined began to fracture the moment the deputies understood that they were being herded. Delay bred suspicion. Suspicion hardened into anger. When Napoleon strode in to address the Council of Ancients, he, a creature of the battlefield, fluent in the trajectory of a cannonball, floundered in the raw, close air of a parliamentary chamber, his words tangling into half-finished threats and appeals. It went far worse when he pushed on into the Hall of the 500, meeting in the chateau's orangery. The deputies rose against him in a wall of fury, crowding around him, seizing him by the collar, shouting him down with cries of "Down with the tyrant" and "Outlaw," the dread word hors la loi, outlaw, which had sent so many to the guillotine and which, once voted, could have ended him within the hour. Jostled, shaken and pale, the man who had ordered thousands to charge into cannon fire was hustled bodily from the chamber by his own grenadiers, the whole enterprise hanging, in that moment, by a single thread. It was his brother who saved him. Lucian, presiding over the seething chamber, refused to put the motion of outlawry to the vote, the one act that might have finished Napoleon then and there, and when he could hold the room no longer, he abandoned the president's chair and had himself escorted outside to the waiting soldiers. There, before the ranks, he swore that the deputies within were being terrorized by a faction of assassins, and called on the troops to clear the hall. In a gesture the propaganda would later dress in high drama, he is said to have caught up a blade and pointed it at his own brother's breast, vowing to strike him down himself should Bonaparte ever betray the liberty of the people. It was theater in the service of a lie, but it did its work. The drums beat, the grenadiers, bayonets leveled, marched into the chamber, and the deputies, faced with the cold arithmetic of steel, scrambled out through the windows into the gardens and the gathering dark. The Republic had fallen, not to a vote of the people, but to a corridor of soldiers. By the next morning, the official account had already begun its work, recasting a near fiasco as the rescue of the Republic from a nest of conspirators, the first bulletin of the new regime, and a foretaste of how it would always tell its own story. In the quiet that followed, the machinery of legitimacy was set turning at once. That same night, a rump of compliant deputies, gathered from those who had not fled, was assembled to give the coup its legal dress. They abolished the Directory and vested the government of France in 3 provisional consuls, Sieyès, Ducos, and Bonaparte. Within weeks, a new constitution, the Constitution of the Year 8, was drafted and rushed into being. It was a masterpiece of political camouflage, built to look like a republic and to function as the rule of one man. It created 3 consuls, but it invested the reality of power in the first consul alone. The other 2, the able jurists Cambacérès and Lebrun, were reduced to advisors and ornaments. There was no declaration of rights at its head, and its tangle of assemblies, a senate, a tribunate, a legislative body, was so contrived that none could truly check the first consul's will. Sieyès, who had meant to be the architect of the new order, found himself eased aside within weeks, pensioned off with an estate and a grand title, outmaneuvered by the very soldier he had chosen for his instrument. So the coup of Brumaire became, by the reckoning of history, the end of the French Revolution, the moment the Republic of Liberty passed, in stages, into the rule of a single hand. He was its heir, the guardian of its social gains, and its gravedigger who had strangled its political life in an afternoon. Napoleon dressed the seizure in the language of the revolution itself, promising order, stability, and the defense of all its gains, and a France sick to death of chaos was ready to believe him. For most people, ground down by a decade of upheaval, the bargain looked like a good one, an end to the fear, a government that might actually govern, and few troubled themselves that the price was their own sovereignty. The men of property wanted order above all things, and order was precisely what he promised. A plebiscite was held to bless the new order, and though its figures were grossly inflated by the men who counted them, the direction of the country's weary consent was real enough. At 30 years of age, the foreign scholarship boy, who had been mocked for his accent in the schoolrooms of his rulers, held the destiny of France in his hands. It had very nearly gone wrong. The man who would soon command half of Europe stood before a room of shouting politicians and lost his voice, and it took his younger brother and a corridor of bayonets to finish what his nerve could not. But finish it they did, and when the shouting died away and the grenadiers had cleared the hall, France had a new master, and the revolution that began with a promise to end the rule of one man over all had ended by handing all men to the rule of one. He called himself First Consul, a modest Roman word, and he spoke the language of the Republic still, but the Republic was a costume now, and everyone who mattered understood it. The question that remained was what this extraordinary man would do with a power that no French king had ever truly possessed, and the answer, when it came, would reshape not just France, but the very idea of what a modern state could be. The revolution had been a glorious and terrible explosion of energy, but when the smoke of the coup cleared, France lay in pieces. The currency was ruined, the administration was a patchwork of local failures, and the legal life of the country remained a tangled thicket of custom that changed from one province, sometimes one parish, to the next. Napoleon did not merely inherit this wreckage, he set about the deliberate, cold-blooded work of turning it into a machine. He had no patience for the abstract debates of the salons or the soaring emptiness of the committee rooms. He cared for the ledger and the map. He looked at a broken France and brought to it the mind of an artillery officer, measuring the forces, calculating the distances, and setting the charge exactly where it would do the most work. He began at the foundations of the state. He established the Bank of France to anchor credit, and a little later fixed the currency in the franc germinal, a coinage of such stability that it would remain the bedrock of French money for a century. He swept away the fractious, half-independent local authorities that had defied Paris for a decade and replaced them, by the law of early 1800, with a rigid pyramid of prefects, one set over each department, appointed by the center, answerable to the center, and charged with driving the will of the state into every commune of the land. It was a structure so effective that it governs the administration of France to this day. He founded the Lycée, a national ladder of secondary schools to form a new elite of officials and officers, their places won increasingly by examination rather than by name. He created the Legion of Honor, a new order of distinction, open to any man for service to the state, bypassing the old titles of blood. And he drew the ablest jurists and administrators of the age into a council of state, which became the engine room of his government. He rebuilt the machinery of taxation so that revenue was assessed and gathered with a regularity France had not known under its kings, and set the state to building roads, bridges, canals, and quays, the visible sinews of a country being organized from a single center. He offered an amnesty that brought home tens of thousands of the émigrés who had fled the revolution, and made his peace with the rebels of the West, ending the long civil war in the Vendée, buying reconciliation and stability as always at the price of obedience. It was the birth of the modern administrative state, efficient, uniform, rational, and entirely subordinate to the man at its summit, and it made real, at last, the revolution's promise that a career should be open to talent rather than reserved to birth. But his most enduring monument was neither a bank nor a school. It was the work of the drafting table, the patient, grinding labor of gathering the chaos of French law into a single coherent whole. He appointed a commission of 4 seasoned jurists to prepare a civil code, and then did what no ruler in his position needed to do. He took part himself, presiding over a great many of the long debates in the Council of State, pressing the lawyers with questions, forcing decisions, mastering the detail with the same appetite he brought to a campaign. The Code Civil, promulgated in March 1804, was the architecture of a new world. It swept away the layers of feudal privilege and regional custom that had defined the old regime and put in their place one uniform body of rules for every citizen: equality before the law, the security of property, the freedom of contract, a secular civil status with civil marriage and divorce, and the principle of careers open to talent made permanent. Its clarity was radical, and its reach became vast. Carried across the continent by French arms and adopted freely far beyond them, it became the foundation of the civil law of dozens of nations in Europe and the Americas, and it endures in them still. The Civil Code was only the first and greatest of a family of codes, of criminal law, of commerce, of procedure, with which he set out to rewrite the whole of French law afresh in language a citizen could actually read. It was, as even his enemies would come to concede, the most durable thing he ever built, the one conquest no later defeat could take back. Yet to see the code only by the light of its brilliance is to miss the deliberate, narrowing hand of its architect. The same lawgiver who built a rational order for men was also a man set on restoring the old authority of the household. The code that proclaimed equality before the law simultaneously wrote the subordination of women into the foundation of French life, stripping wives of rights they had briefly held in the Revolution and binding them to the legal authority of their husbands, unable to control their own property, hemmed in before the courts. A wife owing obedience as the household owed obedience to the state. It was no lapse in the logic. It was policy, the family remade as the smallest and most orderly unit of a disciplined nation. The lawgiver's great gift to equality was, for half the population, a closing of doors. He sought the same stability in the spiritual life of the country. The Revolution had waged a bitter and often brutal war on the Catholic Church, seizing its lands, persecuting its priests, and leaving a devout countryside estranged from the new order. Napoleon, who valued religion not as revealed truth but as an instrument of social peace, moved to close the wound. In the Concordat of 1801, negotiated with Pope Pius VII, he brought the Church back into France. The state recognized Catholicism as the faith of the great majority of Frenchmen and undertook to pay the clergy, while the Church, for its part, renounced all claim to the vast estates the Revolution had confiscated and sold, securing that revolutionary settlement forever, and accepted that its bishops would be nominated by the government and bound to the state. It was a masterstroke of pacification, reconciling millions of Catholics to his rule while chaining the altar firmly to his throne. It healed the bitter schism the Revolution had opened between the priests who had sworn allegiance to the new state and those who had refused it, and it won him the quiet loyalty of the countryside at the modest cost of a church that now depended on him for its very existence. And it set the stage for a bitter irony to come. The Pope he had brought to terms in 1801 would be summoned to Paris 3 years later, only to watch Napoleon take the crown from his hands and set it upon his own head, and yet, in the very same years that he was knitting together the laws of France and making his peace with Rome, he committed the darkest act of his rule, one that no measure of administrative genius can lighten or offset. In 1794, the Revolutionary Convention had abolished slavery in the French colonies, the single most unambiguous act of liberation the Revolution ever performed. On the 20th of May 1802, Napoleon's government reversed it. By that law, the state maintained and restored slavery in the colonies, and restored the slave trade that fed it, making France the only nation in history to re-legalize human bondage it had already abolished. This was not done in ignorance of its meaning. 8 years after a people had been declared free, the freedom was revoked by deliberate act of policy. for the sake of the colonial plantations, the sugar wealth of the merchant interest, and the shape of an empire to be rebuilt upon the labor of the enslaved. It must be stated plainly and left to stand with the weight it carries. The lawgiver who gave the world a code of equality also signed a people back toward their chains. To enforce that decree in the richest of the colonies, he sent a great expeditionary army across the Atlantic to Saint-Domingue under the command of his own brother-in-law, General Leclerc. There the formerly enslaved had already freed themselves and built a new, self-governing order under the extraordinary leadership of Toussaint Louverture, who had made the island's liberty a fact. Napoleon's purpose was to undo that fact, to break the self-governing colony and force its people back into the plantations. Toussaint resisted, then agreed to terms, and was repaid with treachery, lured to a meeting, seized and shipped to France, where he was imprisoned in the cold mountain fortress of Fort de Joux and left to die there, of neglect and the winter, early in 1803. But the war Napoleon had begun could not be won. When the people of Saint-Domingue understood that slavery itself was to be restored, they fought with the desperation of those who would not be re-enslaved, now under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And yellow fever destroyed the French army from within, killing Leclerc himself before the year was out, along with thousands upon thousands of his soldiers. The expedition collapsed in ruin. On the 1st of January, 1804, the colony declared its independence as Haiti, the first nation in history to be founded by a successful revolt of the enslaved. Napoleon had failed utterly to restore the chains, but the attempt and the dead it cost on every side belong to his ledger, and the stain of it does not wash out. So here, in these few crowded years, stands the whole of the man in a single frame, and neither half of the legend can hold it. He gave France, and through France the world, a code of law so clear and so just in its foundations that it still governs the private lives of hundreds of millions 2 centuries later. And in the very same season, with the same signature, he dragged a freed people back toward the chains their revolution had struck off and drowned an army trying to do it. The lawgiver and the slaver were one man at one desk in 1 year. This is what it means to look at Napoleon whole, to hold the code and the crime in the same hand and refuse to let go of either. And now, having rebuilt the republic from its foundations, this son of the revolution that had killed a king was about to do the one thing that revolution had been made to abolish. He was going to make himself a monarch and place the crown with his own hands upon his own head. The transformation of a republic into a monarchy did not happen in a single stroke. It was a slow and deliberate climb, a ladder built of plebiscites and proclamations, each rung lifting Napoleon a little nearer the summit of undivided power. The first great step had come in August of 1802, when a compliant Senate and a national vote made him consul for life, with the right to name his own successor, a monarchy in all but the word, a crown that dared not yet call itself one. Yet a life consulship was a resting place, not a destination, for an ambition that had long ago outgrown the vocabulary of the Republic. Napoleon looked at the map of Europe and saw a continent of hereditary thrones, of ancient houses rooted in the soil of 1,000 years, and he measured his own position against theirs. His rested on the shifting ground of revolutionary consent, and it lacked the one thing those houses possessed above all others: permanence. A life consulship died with the man who held it. A dynasty did not. To lock the gains of the revolution beyond the reach of the exiled Bourbons, to render the assassination of one man pointless and the restoration of the old kings unprofitable, he reached for the oldest instrument of legitimacy in the world. He would found a line and turn his own blood into a royal blood. The reasoning he offered the nation was one of stability, and there was truth in it. But beneath the logic ran something older and simpler, the wish to possess, to fix his greatness in permanence and pass it to a son. And the path to that throne was darkened at the very outset by an act the later memoirs would labor to explain away. In the winter of 1804, the regime uncovered, or claimed to uncover, royalist conspiracies against the first consul's life, and Napoleon resolved to answer them with a warning no plotter could mistake. His agents crossed the Rhine into the neutral German territory of Baden, seized a young prince of the House of Bourbon, the Duc d'Enghien, and carried him back across the frontier by force. He was brought to the fortress of Vincennes, tried in haste before a military commission in the dead of night, and shot in the castle ditch on the 21st of March. Against him nothing had truly been proven. By the law of nations, it was a kidnapping on foreign soil and a judicial killing, and it sent a shudder through every court in Europe. Proof: the crowned heads told one another that the Corsican would cross any line to secure himself. In France, it silenced the royalist salons at a stroke. The regime had shown its teeth, and everyone understood now that this throne would rest not on divine right, but on iron. By the spring, the transformation had become law. On the 18th of May, 1804, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Emperor of the French, a hereditary title confirmed once more by a plebiscite whose numbers were inflated, but whose direction was real enough. The very form of the words strained to hold two worlds together. Not Emperor of France, in the manner of a king who owned his land like an estate, but Emperor of the French, a sovereign whose authority was said to rise upward from the people rather than descend from God an inheritance. It was a monarchy dressed in the borrowed language of the nation it had just replaced. And, to lend the new crown a radiance no vote could supply, Napoleon summoned the one man in Europe whose blessings still carried the accumulated weight of 1,000 years. He would not travel to the church as emperors had done for centuries. He asked the church to come to him. That Pope Pius VII consented to make the long journey from Rome to Paris in the depths of winter was itself a measure of how far the ground had shifted. For 1,000 years, sovereigns had gone to the pontiff to be crowned. Now the pontiff came to the sovereign. On the 2nd of December, 1804, in the vast cold nave of Notre Dame, hung with eagles and cloth of gold against the December chill, the ceremony unfolded before the assembled dignitaries of the new order. 1,000 years of tradition dictated its climax. The Pope would lift the crown and set it upon the ruler's head, the gesture by which the Church conferred earthly power, and the monarch, in the same instant, acknowledged a spiritual authority set above his own. But when the moment came, Napoleon did not kneel to receive it. He took the crown up in his own hands and set it upon his own head himself, and then turned and crowned the kneeling Josephine before him. The meaning was lost on no one in that cathedral. He would be beholden to no man for his sovereignty, not to the church, not to the pontiff seated beside him, not to any authority in heaven or on earth. He was the author of his own crown. The foreign scholarship boy from Ajaccio, mocked once for his accent and his poverty in the schoolrooms of his rulers, had reached the oldest summit in the West and taken it with his own two hands. And in that same ceremony he swore an oath that held the whole contradiction of his reign inside a single breath. He pledged as emperor to maintain the integrity of the territory of the Republic, to respect and enforce the equality of all citizens before the law, and to preserve the irreversibility of the sales of the national lands, those vast estates seized from the church and the fleeing nobility during the Revolution and sold off to the peasants and the townsmen who now farmed and owned them. Here was a hereditary monarch, poised to raise up a new imperial nobility of his own creation, swearing on the day of his coronation to protect the central achievements of the revolution he was in the very act of burying. He was the revolution's heir and its gravedigger in the same instant, and the oath he took pointed in both directions at once and meant them both. He would keep the revolution's practical gains, the land in new hands, the career thrown open to talent, the equality of citizens before a single code of law, and he would strangle its liberty, its republic, and its sovereignty of the people, and set himself upon the empty throne where the people had been. To fix the moment forever in the shape he wished it remembered, he turned, as he so often did, to the power of the image. He commissioned the great painter Jacques-Louis David, once the brush of the revolution itself, the man who had painted its martyrs, to render the coronation on a canvas the width of a wall, and David labored over the enormous work for years. When it was at last unveiled, it was a masterpiece, and it was a quiet falsehood. It did not depict the act that had scandalized Europe, the emperor crowning himself. David chose instead the softer, safer instant in which Napoleon crowns the kneeling Josephine, a gesture of tenderness set in the place of a gesture of usurpation. And in the gallery, at the very center of the composition, presiding in serene approval over the whole scene, the painter set Napoleon's mother, who had not in fact been present at all, but had stayed away in Rome amid a bitter quarrel among her sons. The state art did not merely record the event, it corrected it, softened it, cleansed it of everything that did not serve the legend. What hung upon the wall was not what had happened in the cathedral. It was what the emperor wished posterity to believe had happened, and for 2 centuries it has very largely succeeded. Beneath the gold and the ceremony, the other engine of the new order was already turning. For all its revolutionary vocabulary, the empire rested upon one of the first modern machineries of surveillance and control, directed from the shadows by the supple and untiring Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché. The press was muzzled, the newspapers of Paris were closed down by the score until only a handful of tame journals survived, printing what the regime permitted and nothing more. A web of informers ran through the salons and the cafes and the barrack rooms so that the national consensus Napoleon claimed to embody was, in daily practice, enforced by the long reach of the state. The paintings told France what to admire. The police saw to it that France said little else aloud. It was a regime that authored both its own glorious image and its own obedient silence. The empire was a fact now, but it was a fact the rest of Europe had no intention of accepting. To the monarchs of the old order, the crown Napoleon had set upon his own head was not a coronation but an insult, a declaration that a soldier of the revolution, a man of no dynasty and no divine right, now demanded a chair among the anointed sovereigns of the continent. They looked at the self-made emperor and saw not a peer but a contagion, and a danger that could not be reasoned with, for a man who could seize a throne would never rest content inside borders he had merely inherited, and Napoleon's state was built, from its foundations up, to answer them. Its centralized administration, its prefects and its conscription rolls, its taxes gathered with the cold precision of the mathematics he had studied as a boy at Brienne, had made France the most efficient engine for war the age had yet produced. The bulletins that would soon carry his victories to every pulpit and marketplace in the land would be composed with the very same artistry as David's canvas, turning each collision of armies into another chapter of a glorious and foreordained epic. The instrument was finished and polished. It remained only for the wars to come and call it into the field. He had done it. The boy from the conquered island, the scholarship charity case mocked for his accent, had taken the most storied crown in Europe out of the hands of the Pope himself and set it on his own head, and no one in that vast cathedral had dared to stop him. It was the purest expression of everything he was, a man who would be the author of his own greatness, who would owe his throne to no god and no dynasty and no birth, only to himself. And yet a crown, however you come by it, is only ever as safe as the swords that guard it, and Napoleon had made himself emperor of a France ringed by kings who would never accept a self-made upstart among their sacred ranks. They were already arming. Within a year the greatest coalition yet assembled would march against him, and on a frozen morning in Moravia, on the first anniversary of the day he crowned himself, Napoleon would give the world the answer, and the masterpiece that made his legend true. The ink on the coronation oath was scarcely dry before the fragile peace of Europe fractured under the weight of his ambition. Napoleon had made himself an emperor, and the old dynasties of the continent, watching from their gilded seats, saw not a sovereign among peers, but a usurper who had to be contained before he grew any larger. By the summer of 1805, a new alliance had taken shape. The Third Coalition, bankrolled by the gold of London and anchored by the disciplined armies of Austria and the vast unblooded reserves of Russia. They were resolved to pull the Corsican down, and Napoleon, true to the pattern of his whole career, resolved to break them first before they could gather their scattered strength into a single fist. For 2 years he had waited on the coast, at Boulogne, massing the greatest force France had ever assembled. The army that would come to be called the Grande Armée sat in its camps above the shingle, drilling in sight of the grey expanse of the channel, waiting for the moment to board the flat-bottomed boats that were to carry it across to the shore of Kent. It was the great strategic dream of his early years as emperor to leap the narrow water, bypass the one power that would not make terms, and strike at London itself. But the dream ran aground on a truth that no amount of French drill could alter. Britain ruled the sea absolutely, and the French and Spanish fleets could not win command of the channel even for the few days the crossing required. Long before the boats were ever launched, Napoleon had turned his back on the water and marched his army east to meet the gathering coalition on land. And then, in October, the sea delivered its final and irreversible verdict. On the 21st of that month, off the Cape of Trafalgar on the Spanish coast, the Royal Navy under Horatio Nelson fell upon the combined French and Spanish fleets and destroyed them in an afternoon of close, murderous broadsides. Nelson himself was shot down on his own quarterdeck and died as his victory was being won. but the victory was total, and its meaning was permanent. The road to London was closed forever. Napoleon would never set foot on English soil. He was a creature of the land, a master of the continental map, and upon the water he was and would remain to the end of his life, powerless. Whatever he could take, he would have to take by marching to it. He did not linger over the loss. With the terrifying speed that was the signature of his generalship, he drove the whole army across Germany toward the Danube, while the Austrians still imagined him pinned against the Channel. He had forged in those years a military instrument of unmatched efficiency, the corps system, by which the army was broken into self-contained bodies, each a miniature army of its own with its own infantry, cavalry, and guns, able to march by separate roads and yet converge within a day upon a single point. It let him move faster than any force in Europe and spread his columns wide to mask his purpose, then snap them shut like a closing hand. By the middle of October he had done exactly that to an entire Austrian army under General Mack, enveloping it at Ulm in the valley of the Danube and cutting it off from supply, from communication, from any hope of retreat. It was a victory of maps and marching legs, won almost without a battle. On the 20th of October, the Austrians laid down their arms and filed out to surrender before the Emperor, and the very next day, hundreds of miles to the southwest, the same fortnight's other verdict was being written in gunsmoke off Trafalgar. On land he had swallowed an army whole, at sea he had lost a fleet. The two events, a single day apart, drew between them the exact shape of his power and its limit. But the war was not finished. The Russians were still coming on, and the Austrian Emperor Francis had not yet given up the field. He was drawing his forces together with his Russian ally for a stand in the cold hills of Moravia. Napoleon pressed after them, deep into Habsburg territory, and by the end of November his own position had grown genuinely precarious. His lines of communication stretched thin behind him, his men tired, the season turning hard. He was far from home in a hostile land with winter closing in, and a lesser commander might have paused. Instead, he set a trap and baited it with the appearance of his own weakness. He pulled his forces back from the commanding high ground near the village of Austerlitz, deliberately thinning and exposing his right flank until it looked brittle enough to shatter, all but inviting the Allied host to fall upon it. The Allied commanders, the young Tsar Alexander of Russia, eager for glory, and the Emperor Francis of Austria beside him, took the bait whole. They looked across the frozen fields and saw a tired, overreaching Napoleon and an army ripe for destruction. On the morning of the 2nd of December, 1805, the first anniversary to the day of his self-coronation in Notre Dame, they poured their heavy columns down from the strategic plateau of the Pratzen Heights and into the valley, pressing against the French right to crush it and cut off the Emperor's line of retreat. They believed they were witnessing the end of the upstart. They were, in fact, doing precisely what he had willed them to do. As the Allied masses abandoned the heights to chase the illusion, the morning fog that had cloaked the low ground began to lift, and the winter sun broke through, the sun that Napoleon would invoke by name for the rest of his life, the Sun of Austerlitz. Beneath it he loosed the divisions of his center, held hidden and waiting, and sent them driving straight up the slopes of the Pratzen that the enemy had just vacated. His marshals Soult and Lannes carried the heights in a rush, and in the space of a few hours the Allied army was split cleanly in two and its center torn open. What had begun as a calculated engagement collapsed into a rout. The legend of Austerlitz, curated in the bulletins that would soon be read aloud in every city of Europe, told of the retreating Russians driven onto the frozen ponds behind the field, of the ice giving way beneath them under the fire of the Emperor's guns, of whole battalions swallowed by the water, a scene of poetic ruin that helped fix his reputation as a man favored by fate itself. The truth was more ordinary and more terrible. Some men certainly drowned as the ice broke, but the numbers the bulletins claimed were an invention swollen for effect. The real disaster was the plain one of any great battle. Thousands of men lay dead and dying in the frozen mud and the reddened snow, broken by canister and musketry and saber, Russians and Austrians and Frenchmen together, and the December cold finished many the fighting had only wounded. The victory was as complete as any in the history of war, and the price of it was a field of the dead. The masterpiece and the killing ground were the same ground. It is possible to marvel at the design and to grieve the cost in the same breath, and the honest account of Austerlitz must do both, and must not let the brilliance of the one erase the weight of the other. The consequences came swiftly and were absolute. The Third Coalition dissolved in the wake of the defeat. Austria, broken and desperate, sued for terms and signed the Treaty of Pressburg within weeks, surrendering territory and influence and bowing to the new reality of French dominance. The blow reached even deeper than a single treaty. The Holy Roman Empire, the ramshackle 1,000-year-old construct of German states over which the Austrian ruler had presided as titular emperor, was rendered a hollow thing by Austerlitz, and within the following summer it was abolished outright, its long history ended by the word of the man from Ajaccio. Napoleon now stood at the center of the continent as its arbiter, a maker and unmaker of kingdoms who could redraw the map of Central Europe from his campaign tent. And yet, in this hour of supreme triumph, something in the completeness of it carried a hidden danger. The victories were coming too easily, and the ease of them was beginning to teach him that the rules binding lesser men did not bind him. He had reshaped the map, humbled emperors, and rewritten the law of a nation, and he had done all of it by the sheer force of his own will and calculation. But the map was widening with every campaign, and the frontiers of his empire were marching ever further from the source of his strength. Each enemy he beat left a vacuum he felt compelled to fill, and each vacuum drew him onward to the next. The Grande Armée was the finest instrument of war in the world, but it was an instrument built for war, and it knew nothing of peace. It could conquer a continent, but it could not tell him when he had conquered enough. He returned toward Paris not merely as an emperor, but as a force that seemed beyond nature, a man who had proven that the impossible was only a problem of logistics. The ledger of the dead was already open and growing, and he had begun, at the very moment of his greatest victory, to believe he could not lose. On the frozen field of Austerlitz, exactly 1 year after he had crowned himself, Napoleon gave the legend the one thing it needed to become immortal, a victory so perfect that men have studied it ever since as though it were a work of art rather than a killing ground. 2 emperors fled before him, a third empire, 1,000 years old, would soon dissolve at his word. He was, in that hour, the master of Europe, and it seemed there was nothing on the continent his mind and his army together could not overcome. But there is a particular danger that comes to men who win too completely, the slow conviction that they cannot lose at all. Austerlitz was the summit, and from a summit in the end there is only one direction to travel. The empire was about to reach its greatest height and plant at that very height the seeds of its own destruction. The triumph at Austerlitz had shattered the old order of Europe, but the man who had authored it did not know how to stop. In the months that followed, he set about remaking the German lands to his own design. He gathered a cluster of the western and southern German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, a bloc bound to France and to him as its protector, and in the summer of 1806 the ancient Holy Roman Empire, already hollowed at Austerlitz, was formally dissolved. To Prussia, long hesitant and long neutral, the sight of French power closing over the whole of Germany at last became unbearable, and in the autumn of 1806 she took the field. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Prussian army still moved to the rigid parade ground rhythms of Frederick the Great, half a century out of date, and it proved wholly unable to meet the speed and the flexible, converging violence of the French corps. On the 14th of October, at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, the Prussian state collapsed in the space of a single afternoon. Napoleon crushed one wing at Jena. His Marshal Davout, badly outnumbered, destroyed the main Prussian army at Auerstedt on his own initiative. Within a fortnight, the Emperor of the French rode in triumph through the Brandenburg Gate of Berlin, and the legend of Prussian invincibility, the bedrock of Northern Europe for 2 generations, was erased in a day. Yet the war did not end at the gates of Berlin. Eastward stood the Russian Empire, its armies still unbroken, and the campaign that followed dragged the Grande Armée into the frozen, desolate flatlands of Poland and East Prussia, far from its supply depots and the mild winters of the West. In the bitter cold of February 1807 at Eylau, the 2 great powers met in a slaughter that beggared description. It was fought through a driving blizzard, in the teeth of a freezing gale that blinded gunners and infantry alike, and men died by the thousands in a chaotic, indecisive, day-long carnage that left neither side master of the field. For the first time, the myth of the invincible emperor was tested not by an enemy army but by the sheer grinding horror of the thing itself. There was no glory to be found in the churned red snow of Eylau, only a glimpse of what total war would cost, and the bulletins that reported it strained harder than usual to call it a victory. Not until the following June, at Friedland, did Napoleon at last catch the Russian army in the open and beat it decisively, and force the young Tsar Alexander to acknowledge the new order of things. The meeting that sealed it in the summer of 1807 took place upon a specially built raft moored in the middle of the river Niemen, a piece of theatre worthy of the man who had authored his own rise. Two emperors, the master of the West and the master of the East, met upon a neutral sliver of timber between their armies to divide the influence of a continent. At Tilsit, Napoleon reached the true zenith of his power. He stood higher than any French ruler since Charlemagne, his word carrying from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. He carved a new duchy of Warsaw out of Prussia's Polish spoils, drew the Tsar into a grand and fragile partnership, and left the conference the arbiter of Europe. He was no longer the general of a republic or the first consul of a state. He was the man who could move a frontier with a stroke of the pen and dispose of kingdoms as though they were his to give. Yet even this partnership carried its own slow poison. To seal it, Alexander had bound Russia to the blockade of Britain, and the ruin that the loss of British trade worked upon Russian commerce would gnaw at the alliance until, in only a few years, the friendship forged upon the raft had soured past saving, and give them he did. With the map of Europe under his hand, Napoleon began to seat his own family upon its oldest thrones, the fullest expression of his hunger for a dynasty and a project that ran clean against the very principle of the revolution he still claimed to carry. He was the man who had risen by talent alone, the artillery lieutenant who had climbed by merit through a world blown open by revolution, and now he behaved as though blood and birth were the only true currencies of stability after all. His elder brother Joseph was made King of Naples and then lifted from Naples and set upon the throne of Spain. His brother Louis was installed as King of Holland. His youngest brother Jérôme was given the newly stitched-together Kingdom of Westphalia, assembled from conquered German lands. His brother-in-law, the dashing cavalry marshal Joachim Murat, was made first Grand Duke of Berg and later King of Naples in Joseph's place. His stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, ruled Italy as viceroy. Not all of them proved the pliant instruments he intended. Louis, set over the Dutch, came to sympathize with his new subjects and balked at ruining their trade to enforce the blockade, until the two brothers were quarreling bitterly over it. The Corsican notary's son had planted his own kin on the ancestral seats of Europe and turned the continent into a sprawling family enterprise. It was the most audacious act of nepotism in modern history, and a revealing one. The champion of careers open to talent was busy founding a house of Bonapartes. It rankled deeply among his own marshals, hard men who had bled for his victories only to watch the crowns pass to relatives who had earned nothing on any field. Beneath the outward show of total mastery, however, the seed of his undoing had already been planted, and he had planted it himself. Unable to beat Britain upon the sea, a truth made final at Trafalgar and never afterward reversed, he resolved to beat her by strangling her trade. Through the Berlin Decree of November 1806 and the Milan Decree that followed, he proclaimed a total blockade of the British Isles and set out to close every harbor in Europe to British goods, to shut London out of the continental market and choke her merchants into ruin. The continental system was his single greatest strategic error, a policy that demanded more than even his power could supply. For the blockade to work at all, it had to hold everywhere, and to make it hold everywhere, he had to command every coast, watch every harbor, and police every frontier from Lisbon to the Baltic. It turned his empire into a vast and suffocating apparatus of customs men and soldiers, and it bred resentment in every port and trading town that depended on the sea. The great harbors of the continent, Amsterdam and Hamburg, the ports of Italy and the Hanseatic coast, fell quiet and began to rot, their warehouses emptied and their sailors idle, while British goods still seeped in through 1,000 smugglers' inlets that no cordon of troops could ever seal. It punished his own subjects and his own allies as sharply as it punished the enemy. It turned reluctant kingdoms into nests of smugglers, and it locked him into a cycle of permanent war simply to enforce an economic weapon that half of Europe and much of France had already come to loathe. To close the ports he had to conquer, and to conquer he had to close more ports, and the circle had no end in it anywhere. The cracks began to show plainly in 1809, when Austria rose once more to try the strength of his rule. On the banks of the Danube at Aspern-Essling in May, Napoleon suffered the first clear, undeniable defeat of his career on a battlefield he commanded in person. He was thrown back across the river, his aura of invincibility visibly dented before the eyes of a watching continent. He recovered, and 6 weeks later he won the field at Wagram, but it was a narrow, grinding, enormously costly victory, not one of the clean masterstrokes of his early years. The Grande Armée that fought at Wagram was no longer the lean and hungry instrument of Austerlitz. It was becoming a vast and cumbersome machine, filled out with young conscripts who lacked the fire of the old volunteers and stretched across a command structure, straining under the sheer scale of the empire it had to hold. The victories were turning Pyrrhic, the butcher's bill climbing with every season, and the horizon darkening on every side. He was, in the end, trapped by his own success. The system he had built demanded total compliance, and yet the more he demanded, the more resistance he called into being. Behind him, the quiet machinery of the civil code did its patient work, standardizing law and modernizing the apparatus of the state across half of Europe. But before him, the map was dissolving into a tangle of obligations, garrisons, insurgencies, and failing frontiers. He was the master of Europe, but a master who could never once afford to sleep. And in the hard, dry country beyond the Pyrenees, a fire had already caught that all his genius could not put out. A nation in revolt, armed and encouraged by the British, that fought not in the great decisive clashes he knew how to win, but in the hills and the villages and the shadows, refusing to be ruled by a foreign crown. The soldiers he poured into Spain did not fall in one glorious battle that could be painted and explained. They simply vanished, drained away drop by drop into a war without a front and without an end. By 1809, the map of Europe had become very nearly a private possession. His brothers wore crowns he had handed them like gifts. His marshals ruled provinces, from Warsaw to Madrid, from the Baltic to the boot of Italy. The will of one man from a conquered island reached into the life of a continent. No European had held such power since Charlemagne, and yet the very completeness of it was the trap. To starve Britain, he had to close every port in Europe. To close every port, he had to control every coast. To control every coast, he had to keep conquering forever, with no possible end. A dominion that can only be held by expanding is a dominion already dying. And in a hard, dry country beyond the Pyrenees, the endless war his ambition required had already begun to bleed him, a wound he himself would come to call his ulcer, that would drain the empire drop by drop for 6 long years and teach a watching Europe the one lesson Napoleon most needed no one to learn, that the Grande Armée could be beaten. The tragedy of the Peninsular War was that it began not as a necessity of survival but as a luxury of arrogance. By the end of 1807, Napoleon had reached a hegemony he believed was very nearly absolute. He had broken the old coalitions, redrawn the map of Germany, humbled the great powers of the East, and bound the continent to his blockade of Britain. Yet one gap remained in that blockade, and it lay to the southwest, where Portugal, Britain's old ally, kept her ports open to British trade. To seal the last door, Napoleon sent an army across the territory of his own ally, Spain, to strike at Lisbon. It was meant to be a swift and surgical stroke, a tidy extension of the grand design. Instead, it became the pivot on which his empire began to turn toward ruin. The decay of the Spanish monarchy offered him a temptation he could not resist. The ruling house of Bourbon in Madrid was consumed by a squalid, bitter feud between the feeble king, Charles IV, and his scheming son, Ferdinand and Napoleon, who saw nations as pieces on a board, resolved to sweep both from it. In the spring of 1808, he summoned father and son across the border to the French town of Bayonne, and there, under the weight of his presence and the shadow of his soldiers, he pressed them both into abdication. In their place, he set his own elder brother Joseph, dragged unwilling from the throne of Naples to rule a country he did not know and whose people had never been consulted. A kingdom had been handed like a parcel from one Bonaparte to another. Napoleon believed he was rescuing a backward nation, that he would bring the enlightened administration of the French state to a stagnant feudal relic, and that the Spanish would be grateful, or at the very least indifferent, to the name of the man who ruled them. He had misread the character of a whole people as completely as he had ever misread anything in his life. The answer came almost at once. On the 2nd of May, 1808, the people of Madrid rose against the French garrison in a sudden, furious, disorganized revolt, armed with knives and paving stones and whatever came to hand against trained troops and cavalry. The rising was put down within hours, and the reprisal that followed the next day, the 3rd of May, saw batches of captured and suspected rebels shot in the darkness outside the city. These killings were not recorded by the official painters of the empire, the men who framed Napoleon as a demigod on horseback. They were recorded against the empire by the Spanish painter Francisco Goya, whose great canvases of the 2nd and 3rd of May, painted some years afterward, and whose harrowing series of etchings, The Disasters of War, stripped the glory from the whole enterprise. Where David and Gros gave the world the emperor in triumph, Goya gave it the other face of the same war, the anonymous, faceless death of ordinary people, the terror and the exhaustion and the unyielding hatred of a population that had been invaded by a supposed friend. Here, for once, the visual record turned against the man who had done so much to command it, and it has never turned back. For what began in Madrid was not the kind of war the French army knew how to win. It was not a contest of lines and columns in which a single decisive battle settled the fate of a nation. It was something the Grande Armée had never faced on such a scale. The guerrilla, the little war, a word the Spanish gave to the conflict and through it to every language since. It was a war of shadows and ambush in which every village was a fortress, every mountain pass a trap, every straggler and courier and supply train a mark for the knife. The Spanish did not need to field an army that could beat the French in the open. They needed only to ensure that no Frenchman could eat, sleep, or move without the constant nearness of death. French columns bred to sweep across the plains of Europe found themselves swallowed by a hostile and unforgiving land, able to win every engagement and hold no ground beyond the range of their own muskets. Nowhere was the spirit of that resistance written plainer than at Zaragoza, the city on the Ebro that the French besieged twice and that fought back street by street and house by house, its people holding out through bombardment, hunger, and disease, yielding the town at last only when there was little of it left standing. Zaragoza became the emblem of the whole war, a people who would sooner die in the rubble of their own homes than accept a foreign king. By the summer of 1808, the catastrophe had already announced itself to the world. At Bailen, in the dust of Andalusia, an entire French corps was surrounded and forced to surrender in the field, the first time in the history of the empire that a large French army had capitulated whole. The news ran through the capitals of Europe like a current. The spell of invincibility, unbroken since before Austerlitz, had cracked, and the British, quick to read the opening, landed an expeditionary force in Portugal under the command of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Wellesley grasped what the French marshals could not, that the Spanish people were an ally who could neither be bought nor beaten into submission, and that the war could be won not by one grand stroke but by a long, patient campaign of exhaustion. He fortified himself in Portugal, and behind the great earthworks and redoubts known as the lines of Torres Vedras thrown across the country before Lisbon, he stood where no French army could reach him and set about bleeding the imperial armies white, trading ground for time and leaving the land and the guerrillas to do the slow work of attrition. From his distant headquarters, Napoleon struggled to take the measure of the failure. He treated Spain as a problem to be solved by force, more troops, new commanders, a stream of orders drawn up far from the ground and increasingly detached from its reality. He had made for himself what he would later call his Spanish Ulcer, a festering wound that would not close and that drained the strength of the empire a little more with every passing month. It was a sinkhole for money, for material, and, most cruelly, for men. Napoleon sent his finest marshals into it one after another. Soult, Massena, Ney, Marmont, and the Peninsula wore their reputations away in turn. Not one of the commanders he could name ever found the key to the war, for there was no key to find, no single army to corner and destroy, only a whole country in arms that closed again like water behind every column that passed through it. The estimates of its cost run into the hundreds of thousands of casualties, though the true figures are past recovering, and the numbers, however large, cannot convey the strategic damage. Spain pinned down the best of his army for 6 unbroken years, from 1808 to the final collapse in 1814, forcing him to wage a permanent war on a second front while the rest of Europe watched and waited and quietly began to calculate the odds of his fall. The deeper wound, in the end, was not material but moral. By seizing Spain, Napoleon forfeited the one great claim that had lent his conquests a kind of grandeur, the claim to be the revolution's armed missionary, the bringer of the code and the leveler of old tyrannies. In Spain there was no tyranny to overthrow that his own aggression did not eclipse. He was no longer the liberator, he was plainly and visibly a conqueror, spending the blood of his soldiers and the treasure of France for the sake of his dynasty and his blockade. And the subject peoples of Europe, held in check so long by the memory of Austerlitz and Jena, watched the Spanish resistance with a slow dawning sense of possibility. If a nation of farmers and priests, without a great army of its own, could hold the master of the world at bay for years, then what might a rearmed Prussia do, or an awakened Russia? The Spanish War lit a fuse of national feeling that Napoleon himself had unwittingly laid, and that he would prove unable in the end to stamp out. And even as his armies were ground down in the passes of the Pyrenees and the parched interior, his mind had begun to drift from the war he could not win toward a problem closer to his heart, the obsession that had driven him to the crown, the continuity of his power, the permanence of the thing he had built, now pressed on him harder than any battlefield. He had raised an empire that spanned a continent, a structure of unprecedented reach, but it was a structure balanced entirely upon the life of one man, and that man had no heir. The absence of a legitimate son shadowed his every decision. He began to look at his own marriage and at the woman who had stood beside him through the whole long climb, and to see in her not a partner but an obstacle. The crown demanded a dynasty, and a dynasty demanded a son, and he was coming to believe that the sacrifice of his own happiness was a price he was prepared to pay. Spain was the first great lie the legend could not cover. There were no dazzling one-day victories here to paint, no captured emperors, no bulletins that could turn this into destiny, only a grinding, faceless, endless war against an entire people who would not be conquered. Bleeding France of men, she would soon need more than she had ever needed them. In front of the whole watching continent, the wound would not close, and it taught the subject nations of Europe the single most dangerous idea of the age, that the man was not invincible, that he could be resisted, that he could be beaten. That idea was already traveling east toward Berlin and Vienna and St. Petersburg, but before it could gather into the storm that would end him, Napoleon turned away from the war he could not win to face a defeat of a quieter and more personal kind, for the master of Europe, who could hand out kingdoms to his brothers, could not produce the one thing his whole design required. He had no son. And to get one, he was about to break the heart of the only person he had ever truly loved. The central paradox of Napoleon's empire was that it functioned as a modern, rationalized state governed by a man who had staked his entire legitimacy upon the oldest and most archaic foundation of all, the hereditary crown. He had dismantled the feudal order across half of Europe, and he had done it in the name of a new royal house, the House of Bonaparte, an imperial dynasty conjured out of nothing in the space of a single decade. By 1809, the contradiction buried in that invention had hardened into an acute and gnawing vulnerability. An empire won by the sword and held together by the singular, extraordinary talent of one man is a fragile thing, for it dies when the man dies. The imperial constitution had tried to guard against that day by fixing the order of succession, naming his brothers in the line should he leave no son of his own, the crown passing first to Joseph, then to Louis. But a throne handed sideways to a brother whom no one had chosen, and whom the marshals and ministers did not fear, was scarcely a throne at all. To make his work permanent, to place it beyond the reach of the assassin and the exiled Bourbons waiting across the Channel, Napoleon required the one thing his vast machinery of state could not manufacture. He required a son of his own blood. The danger was not abstract. On a December night in 1800, as he drove to the opera, a barrel of gunpowder concealed in a cart had exploded in a Paris street moments after his carriage passed, killing and maiming bystanders and missing him by seconds. The regime he had built rested in the end upon a single life, and that life could be ended in an instant by a length of fuse. A son would not stop the bomb, but it would make his death a change of reign rather than the collapse of a world. And that son, the essential capstone of the whole design, remained an absence. For years, Napoleon had lived with Josephine, his partner in the long climb from the fringes of the minor Corsican nobility to the imperial throne of France. She had been his confidant and his comfort, the woman who had shared the frantic, volatile years of his ascent. Yet the marriage had produced no child, and the reason was no longer in doubt. Josephine had borne 2 children in her first marriage and could bear no more. And Napoleon, by the plain evidence of children fathered elsewhere, a son born to one of his mistresses in 1806, later acknowledged and given a title, and another to a Polish countess in these same years, had proof enough that the fault of their childlessness did not lie with him. As the empire grew, as he redrew the map of Europe and gathered the ancient regalia of monarchy about him, the empty cradle at the center of it all became a political emergency. If he fell, to a bullet, to a fever, to the slow illness that had killed his father, the entire structure would dissolve into the chaos of a disputed crown. The decision to put Josephine aside was the point at which the cold logic of the statesman finally overrode the man. There is no record of his private feeling in those weeks that does not bear the fingerprints of the later legend-making, for he was a man who understood, better than any, the value of a well-told sorrow. But the documented facts are stripped of artifice. In the last weeks of 1809, he told her his purpose, and the dissolution was staged as a state occasion, with a grim and clinical formality. On the 15th of December, before the assembled imperial family and the highest dignitaries of the empire, Napoleon and Josephine each read a prepared declaration ending their union. Her composure failed partway through, and an official finished the reading of her words for her. She kept her title of Empress, her house at Malmaison, and a great pension, and the religious annulment granted by a compliant church court in Paris on the convenient ground that the hurried wedding of 1804 had lacked its proper parish priest and witnesses, followed early in 1810 and cleared the way for a new and wholly political marriage. He had chosen the dynasty over the woman, and reasons of state had won. If the object was legitimacy, he would not settle for a princess of the second rank. He would reach for the highest prize in Europe. There were 2 great houses whose blood could ennoble the parvenu emperor, and for a time he weighed the one against the other. He put out feelers toward the Romanovs, toward a young sister of Tsar Alexander, and was met with evasion and delay from a St. Petersburg court that could not bring itself to the match. And he turned toward Vienna, toward the Habsburgs, the oldest and proudest dynasty on the continent, the house he had beaten on the battlefield again and again. It was the Austrian foreign minister Metternich who saw the advantage for his own shattered country in binding the conqueror by marriage, and the Austrian match was made. The bride was Marie-Louise, Archduchess of Austria, the eldest daughter of the Emperor Francis, the same monarch Napoleon had defeated at Austerlitz and at Wagram, whose capital he had twice occupied. The irony ran to the bone. Marie-Louise was a great-niece of Marie Antoinette, the queen whom the Revolution had sent to the guillotine, and a descendant of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa. She had been raised in a court that taught her to regard Bonaparte as the ogre of Europe. By marrying her, the soldier of the Revolution that had killed a Habsburg queen was grafting his raw new empire onto the ancient trunk of the Habsburgs, binding the newest throne on the continent to the oldest. The union was solemnized by proxy in Vienna in March of 1810, and shortly after, the 18-year-old Archduchess crossed into France and was married again in person beneath the vaults of the Louvre to the man who had been the terror of her father's reign. For a moment, the gamble seemed to have paid in full. In the early morning hours of the 20th of March, 1811, the guns of Paris began to fire the salute that would announce the birth. The city had been told the code in advance. 21 guns for a daughter, and if the child were a son, the salvo would go on. Crowds counted in the streets, and at the 22nd shot, Paris erupted, for the empire had its heir. The boy was given the resounding title King of Rome, a name chosen with deliberate weight. It echoed the old title borne by the heir to the Holy Roman Empire, and it staked the claim of the new empire to the mantle of the ancient one, this at a time when Rome itself had been annexed to France, and the Pope who had crowned Napoleon was his prisoner. The child was a living treaty, half Bonaparte and half Habsburg, a creature of the new order and the old, designed to anchor a dynasty meant to reign for generations. In the eyes of the court, and in the carefully drafted bulletins that carried the news to every capital, the empire was no longer one man's improvisation. It had become a settled, hereditary reality. By the summer of 1811, the Napoleonic system had reached its absolute zenith. The empire proper stretched from the shores of the Baltic to the coast below Rome, 130 departments governed from Paris. Beyond its borders lay a ring of satellite kingdoms, and beyond those a chain of forced alliances that reached to the edge of Russia. His brothers wore crowns, his marshals governed provinces, his stepson ruled in Italy, and now an heir of his own blood lay in the imperial cradle. Yet even at this summit the structure was already vibrating with a hidden and fatal instability, and the fault ran through the very policy that had made him master of Europe, the continental system, the vast blockade by which he meant to close every port on the continent to British trade and strangle the one enemy he could not reach across the sea. It was a cruel and unnatural instrument. It impoverished his own subjects, throttled the commerce of his allies, and demanded a total, unbroken obedience that the nations of Europe were ever less willing to give. For the blockade could work only if every coast obeyed, which meant that Napoleon could never stop enforcing it. The deepest crack ran east toward Russia. Tsar Alexander, his partner in the grand bargain struck on the Niemen 4 years before, found the blockade a slow poison to his own country, and by the end of 1810 he had reopened his ports to neutral shipping and laid new duties on the French goods that flowed into his empire. Fresh grievances piled onto the old. Napoleon's annexation of a small German duchy, whose ruling house was tied by marriage to the Tsar, the standing threat that the French-sponsored Duchy of Warsaw posed to Russia's Polish lands, the endless friction of two absolute wills that could not both command. The alliance that held the whole eastern flank of the empire together had become a hollow shell, and it was cracking a little more with every month the blockade dragged on. Napoleon was a man who measured success in totalities. He had coerced or defeated every other power in Europe, and he could abide neither an ally who behaved as an equal nor a problem that overwhelming force had failed to solve. And he had already fixed his gaze upon the one great power still standing outside his system, and begun, methodically, to prepare the war that would bring it to heel. In the spring of 1811, holding a newborn son who was already a king, Napoleon had reached the place his whole life had been climbing toward. He had the empire, the greatest since Rome. He had married the oldest royal blood in Europe, and now he had an heir of his own to inherit it all. The dynasty of the Corsican notary's boy would sit among the ancient houses of the continent, and it would last 1,000 years. That was the dream, whole and shining, in 1811. It would be gone in 3. For the entire towering structure now balanced on a single failing joint, the alliance with Russia cracking a little more with every month the ruinous blockade dragged on, and Napoleon, who had never in his life been able to leave a problem unsolved or an enemy unbeaten, was already turning his gaze east, toward the one country too vast to conquer and too proud to obey. He would gather the largest army Europe had ever seen, and he would march it into Russia, and almost none of them would come home. The alliance with Russia, the cornerstone of Napoleon's continental order, had always been a brittle thing built upon the shifting sands of mutual suspicion and conflicting interest. By 1812, the structure had finally collapsed under the weight of the continental system. The Tsar, Alexander, could no longer force his nobility to endure the economic ruin that the blockade of British trade inflicted upon them, and Napoleon, whose whole legitimacy rested upon his power to isolate and humble Britain, would not tolerate so public a defiance. He resolved that Russia must be brought back into the fold, and he meant to do it with the same decisive violence he had applied to every other obstacle in his path. A single overwhelming blow near the frontier, the destruction of the Russian field army, and terms dictated from a position of absolute mastery. It was the logic that had won at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland, and he saw no reason it should fail him now. He even gave the coming war a name that flattered his Polish subjects and veiled his true purpose, the Second Polish War, as though he marched to liberate rather than to compel. Through the spring of 1812 he assembled the largest engine of war the modern world had yet seen. It was a force that beggared imagination, a multi-ethnic host of some 600,000 men drawn from the length and breadth of his subjugated Europe. There were Frenchmen, but fewer than half. The rest were Poles, Italians, Germans of the Confederation of the Rhine, Dutch, Swiss, and even reluctant contingents extracted from Austria and Prussia, the very powers he had beaten. The land ahead could not feed such a multitude, and he had tried to prepare for it, gathering vast magazines of supply and a train of thousands of wagons, a commissariat larger than any he had ever built. But no train yet devised could keep pace with an army of that size across roads that were little more than rutted tracks. In the last days of June, the Colossus began to cross the river Niemen, and from a rise on the bank, Napoleon watched the columns pour eastward until they filled the horizon. He crossed it as the threshold of a final victory. He was, in truth, marching into a trap made not of soldiers but of distance and silence. The Russian response was not the one he had prepared for. Rather than concentrate and give him the great battle he needed, the two main Russian armies fell back, drawing apart, evading his lunges to trap them, retreating ever deeper into the immense and brooding interior of their own country, and burning as they went. The retreat was itself a wound to Russian pride. The commander who ordered it was reviled for surrendering the motherland without a fight, until he was replaced in the field by the old one-eyed Kutuzov, who, to the dismay of his own officers, promptly continued the very same retreat. The scorched earth withdrawal was not merely a maneuver, it was a refusal to play the game Napoleon had perfected, a decision to trade space, of which Russia had an unending supply, for the time that would destroy him. As the Grande Armée pressed inland, the country itself became its chief adversary. The summer heat was suffocating and the roads dissolved into choking dust. Then the rains came and turned them to mud. There was little to forage in a land stripped bare ahead of them, and the long thinning supply lines could not make up the difference. Disease, dysentery and typhus above all, moved through the ranks before a shot had been fired in anger. The horses died in their thousands for want of fodder, and with them went the cavalry that were the army's eyes and the teams that hauled its guns. When at last the Russians made a stand at Smolensk in August, the city was stormed and left in flames, but the enemy slipped away once more into the east, intact and unbeaten. By the time the army neared Moscow, it had already lost, to heat and hunger and sickness and desertion, a great part of the men who had crossed the Niemen. The distances themselves were doing the killing, patiently, without a battle. The reckoning came at last at Borodino on the 7th of September, some 70 miles short of Moscow, where the Russian commander Kutuzov turned to bar the road to the ancient capital. The engagement that followed was the bloodiest single day of the entire Napoleonic era, a frontal collision of massed artillery and dense infantry across a few square miles of field and redoubt. Through the long hours, the great guns fired into packed ranks at close range, while wave after wave of French and Allied troops threw themselves against the Russian earthworks, the fortified points that changed hands again and again in the smoke. When the firing slackened at dusk, the field held the dead and wounded of both armies in numbers that have never been fixed with confidence, but that ran together into the neighborhood of 70,000 men. It was a victory of a kind, for in the night the Russians drew off and left the road to Moscow open, but it was a hollow one. Napoleon, unwell that day and uncharacteristically cautious, had held back the Imperial Guard, his last unbroken reserve, and refused to spend it to turn the Russian withdrawal into a rout. And so the Russian army, mauled but not destroyed, drew away in good order into the depth of the land. He had won the field and settled nothing. The Russian generals, gathered in council at a village outside the walls, resolved to yield the capital rather than hazard the army that was their last shield. The city could be retaken, but the army could not be replaced. And so Napoleon entered Moscow on the 14th of September, expecting the delegation of notables who by every European custom should have come out with the keys of the city and a plea for terms. Instead, he found a silence. The old capital had been all but emptied of its people, and within a day of the French occupation, fires broke out across the city and spread, set by the Russians themselves, who had stripped Moscow of its fire engines before they left, until the wooden heart of old Russia had all but consumed itself rather than shelter the invader. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as the sky turned a livid red, and withdrew for a time to a palace beyond the walls while the flames ran their course. Then he waited. For 5 weeks he lingered in the charred and looted city, sending overtures of peace to a Tsar who would not so much as reply while the season turned against him and the first cold came into the air. The greatest gambler in Europe had walked into the one situation his genius could not master, an enemy who simply would not concede that he had lost. The retreat began on the 19th of October, and it became one of the most terrible ordeals in the history of war. Napoleon tried at first to withdraw by a southern route through country he had not yet stripped, but Kutuzov blocked him at Maloyaroslavets and forced the army back onto the same ravaged road by which it had come, a corridor already eaten bare, littered with the wreckage and the dead of the advance. What followed was less a march than a disintegration. It became the custom afterward to lay the whole catastrophe at the door of the Russian winter. But the truth is harder. Hunger, disease, and the ruin of the horses had hollowed the army through the long summer and the failed lunge to the south, so that when the deep cold came down, it fell upon men already starving and unstrung, and finished what the distances had begun. The early snows arrived, and then a cold beyond anything the men had known, a cold that split the wood of the wagons and froze the sentries where they stood. The surviving horses died, and the guns and the wounded were abandoned with them. The Cossacks hung on the flanks of the endless straggling column, cutting off the stragglers, falling on the supply trains, giving no rest. Men lay down in the snow to sleep and did not rise. Others fell by the roadside and were left where they lay. At the river Berezina, in the last days of November, the trap very nearly closed for good. The bridges gone, two of Napoleon's engineer generals drove their pontoon companies into the ice-choked current to throw up makeshift crossings, and the remnant of the army fought its way over under fire while thousands more died in the water, on the banks, and in the crush when the bridges were at last put to the torch with men still on the far shore. When the survivors finally staggered back across the Niemen in December, the host that had numbered 600,000 in June had been reduced to a broken remnant, a fraction so small that the figures have been disputed ever since. The most careful reckonings set the dead, the lost, and the captured across the whole campaign at something on the order of 400,000, though the true toll will never be counted. But the destruction was very nearly total, and that much is beyond dispute. The instrument of his power had been annihilated, not in one great battle that could be painted and explained away, but slowly, anonymously, across 1,000 miles of frozen road. In December, the regime published in Paris the notorious 29th Bulletin of the Grande Armée, which admitted to France for the first time the scale of the catastrophe in Russia, and then closed with the assurance that the emperor's own health had never been better. He had taken the largest army the world had ever seen into Russia, and he brought back a rumor of one. The snows and the distances, and a people who would burn their own holy city rather than yield, had done what no army in Europe had managed in 20 years. They had destroyed the Grande Armée, not in a single great defeat that could be painted and explained, but slowly, anonymously, mile by frozen mile, until the instrument of his power was simply gone. Napoleon himself raced ahead of the ruin in a sleigh, hurrying back to Paris to raise new armies before the news could bring his enemies down on him, and the news was already running ahead of him. For the watching powers of Europe had seen the impossible at last made plain. The man was not invincible, the spell was broken. And now from every corner of the continent he had humbled, the kings and the peoples he had beaten were rising together all at once to bring the whole empire down. The wreckage of the Grande Armée in the Russian winter was not merely a military disaster, it was the shattering of an idea. For nearly 2 decades, the myth of Napoleonic invincibility had stood as a pillar of the European order, a terrifying certainty that kept kings in their palaces and coalitions from forming. Once that pillar collapsed in the snows between Moscow and the Niemen, the continent seemed to wake from a long and fevered sleep. How fragile the whole edifice had become was exposed even before he reached home. While he was still in Russia, an obscure general in Paris had briefly seized the capital's garrison on nothing more than the false report that the emperor was dead, and for a few hours the machinery of the empire had faltered, a warning of how much rested upon a single life. The coalition that now gathered was not another alliance of convenience. It was a slow, converging surge of nearly every power on the continent: Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Sweden, and the German states, nations that had been beaten, humiliated, and partitioned by his will, and that at last understood that his genius could no longer overcome the sheer arithmetic of their combined numbers. Napoleon returned to Paris in the final weeks of 1812 with a speed that startled his own ministers, and at once set his administrative machine to the raising of a new army. In the first months of 1813, he performed a feat of mobilization that stands as a monument to the state he had built, conscripting a fresh host from the young, the exempted, and the barely trained, a generation of boys the army would call the Marie-Louises after the Empress, whose name was signed to their call-up decrees. But it was a hollow army for all its numbers. The veteran corps had been left in the Russian snow, and, more crippling still, the cavalry and the horses could not be replaced, so that he would march into the coming campaign half-blind, unable to scout the enemy or to pursue him once beaten. And the ring was already tightening. The Prussian corps that had guarded his northern flank went over to the enemy that winter, and Prussia herself soon declared against him, her people rising in a war they cast as one of national deliverance. When he marched into Germany that spring, the old predatory grace was still there. At Lützen and at Bautzen, he bloodied the coalition armies and drove them back, proving that the master of the field had not lost his hand. But the victories were barren. Without cavalry, he could not turn them into the annihilating pursuits that had once broken empires in a day, and each one cost him men he could not spare. Among them, near Bautzen, the closest friend of his inner household, the Grand Marshal of his palace, killed by a cannonball at his side. When a summer armistice was proposed, he accepted it, and the pause, which he meant to use to rebuild, served his enemies far better than himself, for it gave Austria the time she needed to complete her turn. Through the mediation of her foreign minister, Metternich, Vienna offered a settlement that would have left Napoleon a great realm within its natural frontiers. When he refused to be bound by it, Austria threw her full weight into the coalition. The Allies had also learned their hardest lesson and made a plan of it. They would decline battle with Napoleon in person and fall instead upon his marshals wherever he was not. It worked. Through the autumn, his lieutenants were beaten one after another in a series of actions across Germany, while the emperor himself won a great victory at Dresden, winning wherever he stood in person and losing the war everywhere he could not stand at once. The end of French power in Germany came in October 1813 at Leipzig, in the battle history remembers as the Battle of the Nations. It was a collision on a scale Europe had never before witnessed, more than 500,000 men fighting for 3 days around a single city, and it was decided by weight of numbers and by defection. At the height of the struggle, whole contingents of his German allies changed sides on the field itself, turning their guns on the men beside whom they had marched that morning. Pressed from every direction and running short of powder, Napoleon ordered a retreat westward across the river behind his lines, and a panicked officer blew the one great bridge while the rearguard was still upon the far bank, cutting off tens of thousands of men and drowning many in the current, among them a marshal of France who had carried the imperial baton for only 3 days. When the smoke cleared, the map had been redrawn. The confederation of client states he had raised across Germany dissolved almost overnight. His brothers and his puppet kings were swept from their thrones, and the empire beyond France's own frontiers simply ceased to exist. By the winter of 1814, the war had reached the soil of France itself. And here, fighting now for the survival of his crown rather than the enlargement of his borders, Napoleon waged what many have judged the most brilliant campaign of his life. Outnumbered several to one, he moved with a frantic, darting energy, flinging himself upon one invading army and then upon another, and in the space of a few days in February, he won a rapid sequence of small, sharp victories that briefly stunned the advancing Allies. It was a masterclass in the economy of force. It was also an exercise in futility. For every battalion he destroyed, the coalition replaced with 2 more, and the terms they offered grew harsher as his position weakened. First the natural frontiers withdrawn, then even the ancient borders of the old kingdom laid down as a condition, and still he would not sign. The flood could not be stemmed. In Paris, his own foreign minister, Talleyrand, was already treating quietly with the enemy. And when the Allied armies reached the capital at the end of March, the city did not rise to defend him. On the 31st of March 1814, the coalition entered Paris, and the marshals upon whom Napoleon had built his legend, the men he had made into dukes and princes, at last refused to lead their soldiers into further slaughter. One of them, entrusted with a covering position, marched his whole corps over to the enemy, and the final hope of holding out was gone. On the 6th of April, 1814, at the palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon signed his abdication. He had tried first to abdicate in favor of his infant son, with the Empress as regent, and the Allies had refused. Nothing short of the unconditional surrender of the throne would serve them now. The terms they then granted were, in hindsight, remarkably lenient. They stripped him of his empire but suffered him to keep the title of emperor. They gave him sovereignty over Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy, with a guard and a yearly income. There are accounts from those days at Fontainebleau of an attempt upon his own life. A dose of poison he was said to have carried since Russia. Its strength faded with time, though whether it was a genuine reach for an ending or the last performance of a man who had always lived for the stage remains a matter of debate. Before he departed, he took his leave of the old guard in the courtyard of the palace, in a farewell the legend would carefully preserve. Then he went to his miniature kingdom, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored to France in the person of Louis XVIII, a brother of the king the Revolution had beheaded. The old order returned as though the intervening quarter-century had been a fever to be slept off and forgotten. But the settlement was flawed at its root. It had left Napoleon alive, restless, and only a short sail from a France that soon wearied of its returned kings. The income promised him went unpaid, and his wife and his son were carried off to Austria and kept beyond his reach. He was watching, and he was near. In the early spring of 1815 he slipped away from Elba, landed on the southern coast of France with a few hundred followers, and marched north. It was the boldest gamble of a life made of them. The troops sent to arrest him found they could not fire upon their old commander. Regiment after regiment threw down their muskets and fell in behind him, and the marshal who had promised the king to bring him back to Paris in an iron cage instead embraced him and brought his soldiers over. He entered the capital on the 20th of March, 1815, without a shot fired in anger, the Bourbon king fleeing before him, and for 100 days the empire breathed again. It was a feverish resurrection, a wager that the powers of Europe would prove too divided or too exhausted to strike back. He had judged them wrong. The coalition had neither forgotten nor forgiven. They declared him an outlaw, a disturber of the peace of the world, and gathered their armies in the north. The final act played out on the 18th of June, 1815, near the Belgian village of Waterloo. The battle was a brutal, day-long struggle against the British army led by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian forces under the command of Gebhard von Blücher. It was not the grand, sweeping, tactical masterpiece of his youth. It was a bloody, grinding contest of endurance. Napoleon threw his Imperial Guard, the mythic center of his strength, into the teeth of the British defensive line, and for the first time in his history, the line did not break. The guard was repulsed, the army disintegrated into panic, and the final dream of the empire died in the mud. 4 days later, he abdicated for the second time. The time for leniency had passed. The powers of Europe were determined that this man would never trouble their peace again. They resolved to put him somewhere from which no escape was possible, a speck of rock in the loneliest ocean on earth, 10,000 miles from anything, guarded by a fleet. And there, on the island of St. Helena, in the last 6 years that were left to him, Napoleon Bonaparte would fight his final and most successful campaign, not against Wellington or the Tsar or the coalition, but against history itself. For the ownership of his own story, he had lost the empire, he would not lose the legend. And the legend he built on that rock is the one the world still half believes today. After Waterloo and his second abdication, Napoleon made for the Atlantic coast, hoping to slip across the ocean to America and a new life beyond the reach of the kings. But the Royal Navy had sealed every port, and in July of 1815 he gave himself up to the British, surrendering at the last to the most implacable and unreachable of all his enemies, and appealing in a letter to the hospitality of the nation that had fought him longest and hardest. That hospitality was refused. He was not received as a guest, but removed as a prisoner, carried by warship down the whole length of the Atlantic to the loneliest cage the world could offer. They had chosen St. Helena, a volcanic speck in the South Atlantic more than 1,000 miles from the nearest coast, ringed by cliffs and watched by a squadron of ships, precisely because no one could reach it and no one could leave it unseen. There, in the sprawling, damp, wind-scoured house of Longwood, the former master of a continent settled into his final confinement. It was a mean and grinding existence for a man who had once dictated the movement of armies across a hemisphere, a scatter of low rooms on a bleak plateau, a shrinking retinue of a few loyal companions and servants, the rain and the fog and the endless wind. He passed his days among the men who had followed him into exile, the Comte de Las Cases, General Montholon, the Grand Marshal Bertrand, and a handful of others, and he quarreled without end with his jailer, the British governor Sir Hudson Lowe, over the petty terms of his captivity, over the size of his allowance, over the boundaries of his daily rides, and above all over the title he was denied, for London would call him only General Bonaparte and never Emperor. The smallness of the struggle only sharpened the stature of the prisoner, and in the close claustrophobic air of Longwood, the man who had authored the history of his age turned to the authoring of his own life. This was the final campaign, and by its own measure it was the most successful he ever waged. On St. Helena, Napoleon set out to win the one war still open to him, the war for how he would be remembered by the generations to come. He gathered his companions, and he talked for hours and days and months on end, dictating his memories, revisiting his battles, framing and reframing his motives, and his words, recorded and shaped above all by Las Cases and published after his death as the Mémorial de Sainte-Hélène, became one of the great publishing sensations of the century and the founding gospel of the Napoleonic legend. It must be read for what it was, not a witness's record, but a deliberate work of self-mythologizing, composed to overturn the verdict of history. In its pages, the conqueror who had bled a continent white was recast as the liberal son of the revolution, the champion of the peoples of Europe, the man of peace forced again and again into war, the visionary who had wished only to unite the continent and had been undone by the reactionary kings and by fate. It was a masterpiece of its kind, and it was in great part a fiction. When the memoirs have him declare that his true glory lay not in the 40 battles he had won, which would be forgotten, but in his civil code, which would live forever, this is not a private confidence overheard. It is a man on a rock in the South Atlantic curating his own legacy, choosing the monument by which he wished to be judged. Much of what the romantic legend still claims to know about Napoleon composed himself here at the very end. The legend he built was powerful enough to obscure even the plainest facts of his person. For 2 centuries, the world has repeated the image of the little corporal, the stunted man whose ambition was as oversized as his body was small. The reality was altogether ordinary. Napoleon stood roughly 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 7 inches in modern measure, a little over 1.5 meters, thus, which was average for a Frenchman of his day, and perhaps a shade above it. He was not a short man. The myth grew from 2 roots, and both can be named plainly. The first was a confusion of measurement. The old French inch was longer than the English inch, so that a height set down as 5 feet 2 in French units, the figure his own valet recorded, was read abroad wrongly as the stature of a dwarf. The second was the savage brilliance of the British caricaturists, above all James Gilray, who drew him again and again as Little Boney, a raging pint-sized tyrant lost inside his own boots, in order to strip the terror of Europe of his dignity and render him ridiculous. The caricature was a weapon of war, and like so much else in this story, it outlived the war, hardening into a fact that everyone knew and no one had troubled to measure. He died on the 5th of May, 1821, as a storm lashed the island, after long months in which his strength had steadily ebbed away. The medical record, then and since, points to a single cause, and it is the very disease that had killed his father, a carcinoma of the stomach, a cancer that had consumed him slowly from within. 4 separate autopsies performed on the island by his own physician and by British surgeons described the ravaged stomach, and an international study by pathologists published in 2021 has only reaffirmed that finding. The rival theory that he was murdered by slow arsenic poisoned by a hand among his household or by the green pigment in the damp wallpaper of Longwood has circulated for generations, but it remains a contested minority claim and not an established fact. The raised arsenic found in surviving locks of his hair is unreliable as evidence, and such traces were present in samples that predate his arrival on St. Helena by many years. The plain and unglamorous conclusion is the one the evidence best supports. He died not by a plot, but by his own failing body. The restless will that had once gripped a continent outlasted at the last by the sickness in his side. Yet even in death he could not be contained. 19 years after his passing, a France grown weary of the greyness of its restored monarchs looked back upon the exile with a deep and nostalgic hunger. In 1840, the government of King Louis Philippe arranged the Retour des Cendres, the return of the ashes. A naval expedition sailed to St. Helena, his body was raised from its plain island grave, and it was borne home across the sea to a national pageant of extraordinary scale. On a bitter December day, his coffin was drawn through the streets of Paris before immense crowds, many of whom had never seen him living, but who had been raised on the story he had dictated from his rock, and he was laid at last beneath the great gilded dome of the Invalides, where he lies still, the object of a reverence he had scripted from his deathbed. The prisoner had come home to conquer the capital of his lost empire a second time, as a memory that no government could ignore and no argument could quite dissolve. We are left then with the necessity of holding two truths at once and of refusing to let go of either. We must grant the full magnitude of the achievement. The civil code that remains the bedrock of the private law of dozens of nations, the rationalized, administered state raised from the wreckage of the revolution, the destruction of the old feudal hierarchies across every land his armies reached, the insistence, built into lasting institutions, that a man's worth should be measured by his talents and not by the name of his father. These were real, and they were transformative, and they shaped the modern world. And we must set against them in the same breath and without flinching the whole of the cost, the millions of men who perished in a generation of war waged for one man's ambition, the self-crowned emperor who buried the republic that had raised him and built in its place a state of censors, police, and informers. And the darkest act of all, the decree of 1802 that restored slavery in the French colonies after the Revolution had abolished it, and the army he sent to drive a people who had freed themselves back toward the plantation, a war he lost, and a stain that no measure of administrative genius can ever wash away. He was the heir of the Revolution and its gravedigger, the liberator who crowned himself, the lawgiver who re-enslaved, the genius who could not stop until he had ruined everything he built. The romantic hero of the legend was real, and so was the darkness the legend was built to hide, and the truest thing we can say is that they were one man, larger and stranger and grimmer than either myth, and nothing at all like the story he wrote for us on his rock. He died a prisoner on a rock in the middle of the sea, 10,000 miles from the empire he had lost, and he won anyway, because the last thing Napoleon Bonaparte conquered was not a country, but the memory of the world, and that conquest has never been reversed. The legend he dictated in his final years is the one most of us still carry, the invincible genius, the little corporal made emperor, the romantic hero brought down by winter and betrayal and fate, and it is a beautiful story, and it is not the truth. The truth is larger, and it is darker, and it refuses to resolve into a hero or a monster. He gave the world a code of law that still governs the lives of hundreds of millions, and he opened the doors of advancement to talent wherever his armies marched. And in the same years, with the same will, he sent millions of men to their deaths for the size of his own ambition, crowned himself over the grave of the republic that made him, built a state to watch and silence his own people, and dragged a freed nation back toward its chains. The liberator crowned himself, the lawgiver re-enslaved. The genius could not stop until he had lost everything he built. That is the man the legend was made to hide. Not the hero of the memoirs, and not the ogre of the caricatures, but Napoleon himself, held whole at last, exactly as he was.